Hi, everybody. Good night. Good evening. It's, I guess, February 22nd. And we're going to begin our ad hoc housing element committee meeting. Before we get going, we'll do roll call. And I'm hoping Laura can help with that.
Yes, Jeff Alves,
Here.
Amy Armsby, Amy Armsby, I see you there.
Here.
Okay, great. Sarah Dory,
Here.
Eric Doyle, Bill Kelly,
Here.
Ann Koffsill,
Here.
Andrew Pierce, Al Sill,
Here.
Nicholas Targ, Bob Turcott,
Here.
Janie Ward,
Here.
Sarah Wernikoff,
Here.
Helen Walter,
Here.
Chair Swisher.
Here. All right. I guess a couple little little business issues I wanted to mention. One is we've had a request from people in town who are participating as attendees that we.
Mondays and Wednesdays.
Sorry, I'm hearing somebody speaking. Who is that? Can you just mute, please? So when attendees are on and one of us turns off our camera, apparently it doesn't show that you are still participating in the meeting. So I just wanted to ask if tonight we're looking for a workaround on that, but we don't have an answer quite yet. So for tonight, we're hoping that if you need to step away, just leave your camera going or put a sticky over your camera so that your name stays in place and it looks like you're still part of the meeting. That'd be great. Also, I wanted to
Through the chair, excuse me, I'm sorry, through the chair, this is Amy Armsby. I have a very tenuous internet connection. I'm not at home, I'm on vacation. And sometimes the only way I can stay connected is to turn off my camera.
Okay.
So, and folks, if they know how to do it, I think they should be able to show the name. They should be able to see who continues to participate by looking at the list of participants. But I don't really think we're in a position to teach them all how to use it.
Yeah.
But
Okay. All right. So anyway, we'll have more instructions next time, but that's totally fine. I know some of you are away this week. Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is Sue Crane had to step down from the committee due to personal reasons. So I wanted to thank Sue on our behalf for participating and being such a great member on the committee. She's done, I just think her voice of reason and experience in the town has been really valuable. Fortunately, Sue's going to continue to be a liaison with Sequoias and will stay involved in the process, which is terrific. So thank you, Sue, for everything and for continuing to be somebody that we can work with. Okay. I think that was it for me right now. I'll turn it over to Laura, I guess. All right, I guess the Woodside Fire Protection District, we're going to have an update.
Through the chair, we should start with oral communications on items that are not on the agenda.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, someday I'll get this all perfect. You guys are going to be amazed. All right, for oral communications, for everybody that's participating from the community, we appreciate your being here. Persons wishing to address the Ad Hoc Housing Element Committee on any subject not on the agenda may do so now. Please note, however, that the Ad Hoc Housing Element Committee is not able to undertake extended discussion or action tonight on items not on the agenda. Comments will be limited to 2 minutes per person. So at the moment, we have 30 people participating from town, although we have a few committee members dialing in too. Where are we here? Attendees, 30 attendees from the town. Okay, so I see there's two hands up. First one, I don't know, Maja Jones.
Hi, thanks for recognizing me. I'm not clear if this is on the agenda or not. I can't quite tell. But I'm wondering if now, if not now, when the committee will be addressing the new press release from the Woodside Fire District that is going to result by July in new maps of the town of very high hazard areas.
Yeah, we actually,
High fire hazard areas. Thanks.
yeah, thank you for your question. We actually have Rob Linder from the Woodside Fire District. That's going to be speaking for the first part of our meeting. So I think we'll cover that then. Ellen Vernazza, go ahead. Ellen? Go ahead. It looks like your mic is off.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I had something to say as far as before you decide where you're putting your high density housing, looking at the maps that you have the different options. I was just wondering about the evacuation plan that you have, and being that there's at least 900 kids in town between the Priory, the Ormondale and Corte Madera, plus the grammar schools. If there was an evacuation with a lot of high density housing smack in the middle of town, and if there's 1,000 kids in there, that the 1,000 parents are going to be going to those schools to get their kids, fighting the traffic going in the opposite direction, I think you should consider this before you start putting a lot of density in an area where it's just going to be a big backstop, like at the corner of Portola Road and Alpine Road, or anywhere down Alpine Road. It just, I mean, have you considered 1,000 parents that are going to go get those kids at school before they will evacuate themselves? Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. Okay, I don't see any other people from the community who want to speak at this point. So now we can go forward on the agenda. Okay, so Laura, why don't I let you do the introduction here?
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. If anyone is new to the conversation, I'm Laura Russell. I'm the Planning and Building Director. We have been participating actively with the Woodside Fire Protection District on a number of different initiatives. And so the district gave a detailed presentation to this committee previously, but we wanted to give the committee an opportunity to hear an update. So we have with us this afternoon, just for a brief update presentation, we have the Fire Chief, Rob Lindner, and we have the Fire Marshal, Don Bullard. They have another meeting tonight, but graciously agreed to join us briefly at the beginning. So the Fire Marshal is just going to give an update, is my understanding, related to their ongoing work related to fire safety. We have a brief opportunity for questions, but we would ask everyone to be thoughtful so they can move on for their other meeting tonight. So I'll hand it over to the Woodside Fire Protection District.
Hey, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Don Bullard. I'm the Fire Marshal with the district. And to answer that earlier request, yes, we will be going over the most recent updates since the last meeting. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and get started. I want to share my screen. Okay. And let's see here. Can everyone see that? Okay. On January 25th, the Woodside Fire Protection District Board of Directors authorized and directed the Fire Marshal to fund and conduct a comprehensive hazard and risk assessment of the fire district. Assessment results will help to designate fire severity zones throughout the district. The board also directed the Fire Marshal to seek its approval to adopt state regulations for minimum fire safety standards related to defensible space that are applicable to the perimeters and access to all residential, commercial, and industrial building construction within the very high fire severity zones. Existing maps are 14 years old, and the district and residents would benefit from a thorough new assessment of the hazards and risks that exist on the landscape today. CAL FIRE's minimum fire safety standards. The regulations detail minimum fire safe standards for structures, subdivisions, developments, roads and driveways, signage, water supply, emergency access and egress, perimeter wildfire protection, as well as building setbacks, fuel breaks, green belts, and measures to protect undeveloped ridge lines within the designated very high fire severity zones. So remember, that's only within the very high fire severity zones. CAL FIRE's Risk Reduction Communities Program. This is a program, according to CAL FIRE, identification and designation of our highest hazard fire areas is the first and most important step responsible communities can take to reduce their risk. These designations are needed to ensure that we fully comprehend the magnitude and severity of the hazards we confront, have adequate resources in place before a wildfire, and have the critical advanced knowledge the fire service needs to anticipate fire behavior and manage both suppression and evacuation. Also, to educate decision makers and the public about the hazards we face so they can take appropriate land use, building, and emergency response steps to reduce the risks, and also to help qualify for public and private grant funding to mitigate the risks, retrofit our homes and neighborhoods, and provide suitable defensible space, evacuation routes, and mitigation measures to protect the community. Public Resource Code 4290.1 requires CAL FIRE to establish criteria to identify communities that follow best practices for community risk reduction. There's 10 criteria, 4 of which are mandatory and 6 optional to qualify for listing as a risk reduction community. And if you want more information on that, there's a link there. Maybe somebody can post that in the chat. Communities that make the list receive preferential scoring for CAL FIRE grant funding for wildfire mitigation and planning. The first mandatory criteria for a risk reduction community is adoption of a local ordinance identifying and designating all very high fire hazard severity zones within the community's local response area. To get on the list, community must satisfy all 4 mandatory criteria and at least 2 of the 6 optional criteria. The mandatory criteria are as follows. First, town ordinance designating very high fire hazard severity zones. Second, submission of parcel maps for very high fire hazard severity zones based on the state's minimum regulations. And then third, submission within the past 8 years of updated safety element that addresses wildfire. And then the fourth is a report on compliance with CAL FIRE recommendations. The optional criteria: ordinance adopting minimum fire safe development, an ordinance adopting defensible space standards, an ordinance adopting a WUI code that is more restrictive than the state's, zoning or special district ordinance with fire mitigation requirements that exceed the state minimum requirements, and an ordinance for comprehensive retrofit of existing homes, and a declaration of wildfire as a high priority hazard. So these are the optional criteria. So why a comprehensive hazard and risk assessment? A comprehensive assessment of the local conditions that affect fire behavior and expansion within our natural and built environment will enable all of us, the district, other local agencies, and district residents to anticipate and hopefully abate or mitigate the most hazardous existing conditions that can intensify and accelerate the expansion and spread of wildfire in our neighborhoods and communities. The assessment will enable and facilitate appropriate hiring, training, and preparation of emergency resources, rapid and an effective tactical and strategic emergency response, prudent land use planning, implementation of CAL FIRE's minimum fire safe building development regulations that we discussed earlier, education of residents and local officials, and public and private funding of fire prevention and mitigation programs. And so that's an update of what's going on with the district and what I have been directed through our board of directors to pursue over. We're trying to get this done. I hope I'm not being overzealous, but I'm trying to get it done. I told the board I would shoot for trying to get it done in July, and that's what we're trying to do. So, if you've seen the press release, I've laid out a plan listing some dates that we're, target dates that we're trying to hit as far as having some public meetings, getting a draft out to the residents to review. I'm currently working on finishing up my advisory board. I'm going to have an advisory board made up of different groups throughout the district. I want to get some community input on this. We're going to start those meetings probably sometime during the first week of March. I'll put out a list of the people that are going to be on the advisory board. I was hoping to get that out by the end of the week. I'll see how that goes, but at some point, for sure, by next week, I'll put out a list of who's going to be on that advisory board. And that's about all I have. I don't know if the chief has anything to say, but that's an update on what's going on with Woodside Fire.
I have nothing further.
Okay.
Jocelyn, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to ask for clarification's sake. Thank you, Don, for presenting. You have got a great timeline on the press release of the different steps that you're going to be taking to get it done by the end of July. I guess my question is for Laura. In terms of timing, how does the new assessment work by the fire district dovetail into the housing element process?
Well, we think we have excellent information for the committee to consider as you're thinking about site selection for the site inventory. And we have had some preliminary conversations with the fire marshal. So we were hoping that the sites that the committee selects will still work as they continue and do their analysis. If we end up in a situation where it doesn't work for some reason, then we'll have to come up with some alternative scenarios. And there is, of course, a chance that we would have to do another update to this housing element if we end up in a place where things aren't lined up. But we remain optimistic that we're on the right track and have good information to make good decisions in anticipation of their maps.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna go to our committee for questions. Looks like Helen, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Hi, quick question. Because we don't have a chat, I couldn't get that link down, all of it. Is there a way that that link can be please sent out? Thank you.
Let's see.
Yes, we can send it out.
Yeah,
Thanks. Lauren.
okay.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, any questions from our community participating? Okay, I see Pat McCrory, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So what's the current situation with fire insurance in Portola Valley?
Is that for me or for?
Would you like to I don't know. Pat, are you asking that of Dawn? I mean, I guess anybody, I mean, Dawn or Laura, if you feel you've got anything to say to that?
Well, I mean, I can only, I don't, that's kind of
It's
a broad
question.
question. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
pretty broad question, but I can
Yeah.
tell you that there are residents in Portola Valley that contact me often about losing their insurance or getting notification from their insurance companies that they're going to lose their insurance due to the area that they live in. Sometimes those insurance notifications come with a letter that says, you know, you need to do this criteria. And if you do this criteria, you know, we'll come back and reassess and you may be able to keep your insurance. Other times that I get people requesting me to come out and talk to them because they get a blanket statement saying, we're just dropping you and that's it, we're done. And I think those are the ones that are the scary ones because they're not giving you an option to go do the work. They're just, I think what they're doing is they're telling people that we have too much liability in this one area in Woodside, and we're dropping that liability in the area, and we're just blanketly saying we're not going to cover anybody in this portion of Woodside or Portola Valley. And in those cases, I feel sorry for them because, you know, their options are limited as to what they can do to get insurance. And there's a lot of that going on right now in both Portola Valley and Woodside. The other folks that get the letter that shows, you know, these are the reasons why we're going to drop you, they can fix those. They can have me come out. I could do an assessment of the property. I could say, yeah, you need to do X amount of defensible space around your house. You need to remove this vegetation that's too close to your house. It's hanging over your roof. You know, we go through the list of assessment items and I say, if you do these things, and, you know, I'll come back out and I'll say that you have a good level of fire clearance around the house. I feel that it's safe. And then if they can send that into their insurance company, they usually allow them to keep their insurance. So that's about all I know about the insurance that, you know, throughout the district. Those are the situations that are going on.
Thank you, Don, for taking that. Okay, we've got, I'm going to go back to our committee and then back to Rita Comas. Hold on a second. Andrew Pierce, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on the insurance situation. I'm an insurance lawyer in my other life. What the insurance companies do is they kind of rotate in and out of our area. State Farm, for example, stopped writing policies a few years ago. And I liked State Farm, so I was not happy. We got Nationwide, and then Nationwide stopped writing it. And State Farm is writing them right now. And they're not very expensive. I mean, relatively speaking. Certainly the earthquake will cost you more. So you just have to shop around. And I don't think the decisions are made on a block by block basis. I think they're made on how many policies do we have in this state of California, in this part of California? What experience did we have with the last fires, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think you should think of it as is my block insurable or not. But most of us are closer to a fire station, for example, than people in other communities, and they seem to like that. If you're looking right now, though, I know State Farm and some other companies are writing it. I just wanted to make that known.
Thank you very much. Okay, back to the community. Rita Comas, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my comment. I just want to say thank you to Woodside Fire Protection District for taking this position and including the residents. And this is me as a just as a resident. And it makes me feel a little safer. I know the insurance companies do have their own set of maps, and that's what they're basing their information on. And I really appreciate this press release and what the Woodside Fire Protection District is trying to do in this community to keep us safe. Thank you.
Hear, hear. All right, next call. Greg, go ahead. Greg, you're on. All right.
It takes a little while to figure out.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Look, and this may be through the chair to Woodside Fire, by the way, a terrific progress on this fire map revision process. One My question was about the insurance that you reported. Are you guys keeping a log of these inbound inquiries and maybe taking some notes about which insurers are doing what? Because I think that's incredibly important information for our community. And if you're not, could you start? Thank you.
I can tell you we're not right now. We haven't been keeping a log of it. I suppose it wouldn't be that difficult. You know, we don't get that many of them. It wouldn't be that difficult if I could keep a record of it for future reference. Anything, you know, I can instruct my inspectors and our administrative secretary to, you know, we can start creating a log of people who call in and say that their insurance is going to get dropped. Is there anything we can do? You know, anybody who contacts us with concerns about it, who's losing their insurance, I can keep a log, who the insurance company is, the date, what, if there's any reasons. Yeah, I mean, we can do that. What kind of future use were you thinking of using that data for? Do we have still?
I'm sorry, this isn't usually a back and forth, so I already moved him back over to the
okay, sorry.
attendees.
Don, let me just take that offline and I'll contact you directly. How about that?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Karen, go ahead. Is that Karen Askey?
Hi, I just wanted to clarify the current state of the insurance out there. Right now, there's only 2 retail insurers that are even interested in Portola Valley, that's State Farm and AAA. And unfortunately, the brokerage insurance, which is a more sophisticated insurance that covers higher end homes, the only insurance company out of that entire list that is even interested or even will glance at your property is Pure, but they aren't particularly interested. And so all these other people are not at all looking at Portola Valley. So the situation's pretty bad. If you want premium insurance, there is the surplus non-regulated market, but that will cost you 150 or 200% of the other costs. So it's not good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Bob Adams, go ahead.
Yes, I had 2 questions. One is we also have the safety element going on at the same time as the housing element. And I'm wondering if the safety element shouldn't lead the housing element. They seem to be doing simultaneously. And so I'm just wondering that what the plan is to coordinate with the safety element.
Okay.
And then the second part of the second question is with regard to Don's work and the mapping, I assume that the housing element will follow Don's mapping when that's complete, expected to be in July.
I'm going to turn this to Laura Russell to answer, please.
The safety element and the housing element are happening at the same time, but we have purposefully identified the parts of the safety element that need to be done first. And we've been working on those so that we can inform the housing element process. So the maps that we're going to be considering later, for example, are largely a result of that safety element work that we're feeding into the housing element process. In terms of Don's mapping, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we feel confident that the materials that we have before this committee right now are going to lead us to reasonable decisions. And if we need to go back and make any changes based on the results of that mapping, then we certainly will figure out how to do that in the process.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I just want to do a check with Don. Are you okay on time?
Yeah, we're doing okay on time.
Okay, all right, thank you. I know you've got something to go to. Valerie Baldwin, go ahead.
Yes, I just was curious if the fire department is also going to be looking at lower fire danger areas, or it's just high fire danger areas, not just, you know, or very high versus high, you know, what they're doing on that.
Sure. When we, when the consultants do the hazard and risk assessment, they will encompass and focus on the entire district. So it will, low hazard, moderate hazard, high hazard, and very high hazard will come into focus. So all of those areas will be mapped out. So, we'll know where the very high is, we'll know where the high is. They'll also map out moderate and low hazard. So yes, to answer your question, they'll all be mapped.
I just want to ask a question, and then I'll go back to the community question that I see one more. I know the town has engaged Zeke Lunder to do mapping for Portola Valley. So is that tying into the work that you're going to be doing in terms of the assessment for?
Well, we're going to put out an RFP,
Okay.
and Zeke could very well be one of the persons that can bid on doing this process.
Okay.
I think he's capable. I'll have to look at what our advisory committee comes up with as far as qualifications to do this job and to do this work. And then we also have to look at logic models and what are the inputs that are required to do this the way it should be done. And so those are the people that will be getting the RFPs to bid on this project.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, I don't know if Laura, you can help. What's the difference in scope between what Zeke is doing for us in Portola Valley versus what he would be doing under this broader project?
Generally speaking, Zeke's scope of work for the town, for the housing element and the safety element, is related to more high level mapping, recommendations, policies, and programs. Usually with the housing element or a safety element, there's additional work that follows, and that's in the form of a program with the capital P. And so there may be things that we identify in that process that would be an appropriate program to do later, and that would be more detailed work. An example of this is oftentimes an evacuation study might be a program with the capital P that we would do later, but the town thought it was so important that we actually started on that sooner. So depending on what the fire district decides to do in their scope of work, then the town will then consider if there's any additional work that we wish to undertake to complement what the fire district is doing.
Okay.
So we're working with them to line up our scopes and see what additional work we'd be interested in.
Terrific. Okay, thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands up from the community. Or from our committee. So I think, Don, you're off the hook now.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll get back to working on my my advisory committee then.
Thank you for being here tonight and making the time. We really
have a
appreciate
good night,
it.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. We're going to move along to the next section of the agenda, and I'll turn it over to our amazing town staff to move forward.
Thank you, Chair Swisher. So this afternoon, this evening, Adrian is going to give the majority of the presentation. This is all the metaphors where the rubber hits the road, or however you want to think of it, of all of the work that this committee has been building up to. So this conversation tonight and at the next meeting are really important in terms of this process overall and fulfilling our obligations under state law. So Adrian's going to go ahead and give a presentation and introduce the technical staff that we have with us to support us for this meeting as well. So take it away, Adrian.
Thank you, Laura. So before we get rolling, I want to introduce the town's housing element consultants that are here with us tonight, Curtis Banks and Carla Violet. They're from Urban Planning Partners. And actually Carla is going to do a little bit of this presentation towards the end, so you'll be seeing her shortly. And we also do have housing element and safety element consultant Zeke Lunder. He's here as well, so he'll be available for questions from the committee and the public. So our key topics this evening, we'll review how the process of building a housing sites inventory and the work plan for completing the inventory from tonight's meeting and onward. I'll also give a quick recap of the committee's first housing sites discussion from its October 18th meeting. We'll go over the affordable housing sites and the HCD's concept of default density for affordable housing sites. And then, as I said, I'll hand it over to Carla Violet from Urban Planning Partners, and she's going to take a little time to go through the maps that were all included in this evening's meeting packet. So you've all seen this graphic before. It was also presented to the community-wide meeting last October. This time we wanted to point out what groups are generally responsible for each step of the work. So firstly, we have identification of suitable sites for the inventory. And the committee kicked off this step at its October meeting and will be continuing on today, including the identification of affordable housing sites that fall within the low and very low RHNA income categories. And these are steps A and B. So once the committee has given staff firm direction on sites, staff will move on to step C, and we'll work with our housing element consultants, 21 Elements and Urban Planning Partners, to firm up the exact dwelling unit capacity for each of the sites. We'll also ensure that the sites selected will pass the HCD's criteria, the California Department of Housing and Community Development. And finally, step E, the committee and staff will ensure the overall inventory is sufficient to meet the town's required RHNA. So here's a graphic also from the packet. It's the work plan. It's a high-level work plan, and this is going to show how the housing sites will be selected and reviewed from here on out. So the Ad Hoc Housing Element Committee will make a formal recommendation on housing sites to be included in the inventory. From there, the committee's recommendation will be presented at the town's next community-wide meeting, and we're anticipating that to occur in mid-March. The committee's recommended inventory, along with community feedback to that recommended inventory, will be presented at the joint Planning Commission and Town Council meeting, and that's scheduled for late March. Response from that joint meeting will be taken by town staff and the town's housing element consultants, and that will all be rolled in together to be incorporated into the draft housing element. So housing site selection must be done within the framework of a rigorous safety analysis. And we took a deep dive into this topic at the committee's excuse me, January 18th meeting, and I'll touch on this in a moment. Housing site selection must also be done according to market feasibility, and this means achievable density and a reasonable chance based on market conditions that a given site will develop in this next housing element cycle from 2023 to 2031. So you'll recall at the October 18th meeting, the committee began its process of housing sites analysis by establishing an analytical framework via mapping. So the committee reviewed the town's main land use maps, including the general plan, comprehensive plan map, the very high fire severity zone map, ground movement potential map, slope map, lot size map, and zoning maps. And this framework revealed general areas of town land to consider for sites analysis. The committee also assessed several draft site scenarios prepared by town housing element consultant 21 Elements. These scenarios are posted on the committee's page on the town website if you want to review, and it's linked in your packet as well. Of those scenarios reviewed, 2 emerged as the scenarios with the highest potential unit yield. So those are the ones we're focusing on now. Scenario B, which is to increase density in the CC and AP districts by allowing increased floor area ratio, or FAR. And then scenario C, allowing multifamily along Alpine Road and Athos Triangle areas via new R3 multifamily zone. The committee also considered the idea of whether housing sites should be dispersed throughout town or concentrated in key areas according to such considerations as ease of evacuation in a fire event, traffic management, and access to shops and services. And the committee expressed overall support for a patchwork approach to housing site selection. And that means drawing from a number of sources, including affiliated housing units and ADUs. So the committee held this comprehensive fire safety meeting on January 18th, where it heard from Susan Hartman from the Town of Paradise, the Woodside Fire Protection District, and Zeke Lunder of Deer Creek Resources, consultant for the housing and safety elements. And he led an interactive mapping exercise. The committee may also wish to consider the Moritz Fuel Hazard Assessment Map, and this is available on the town site and also linked in today's meeting packet. And for any of the members of the public listening in, you may wish to go back and watch that fire safety meeting from January 18th. It was extremely comprehensive and there's a lot of good information. That recording is posted to the ad hoc committee's webpage under meeting recordings, the drop down. So after Zeke's presentation at the fire safety meeting, the committee requested a summary memo of Zeke's recommendations. It's attachment 1 to the meeting packet for this evening, but I have provided some of the key highlights here. So the first is that the highest hazard areas of town are on steeper slopes, canyons, or gullies, are in difficult to access places where vegetation management is particularly difficult. Hazards are amplified in the east-west oriented canyon areas where topography will funnel strong autumn winds. And historic weather data suggests that a catastrophic fire is most likely to come from the east and during the autumn season. Some other key points that came out of Zeke's memo. He suggested avoiding building on new dwellings on slopes over 20%, avoiding development on hillside areas where access to vegetation management is constrained on slopes below structures. Multifamily housing should not be constructed on dead-end streets or neighborhoods with potential evacuation problems. Maximize vegetation thinning within the right-of-way along major arterial travel routes. And that Alpine and Portola roads are the safest options for new development since they are relatively flat and they fall beyond the path of slope-driven wildfires. So once again, Zeke is available to answer any questions at the end of this presentation. So this is another chart that the committee has seen before. This is the RENA draft projection estimate. And we saw this in last fall when we took a first look at it. We have tweaked the numbers slightly since then to reflect information that's been brought forth to the committee between then and now. But I do want to mention that these numbers could still change as we move along in this process between now and when the draft housing element is available. So just to go through the chart one line at a time, more or less. The first line we see are baseline RENA numbers, and these are given to us by the state. The second line we see there's the built-in zoning target or buffer. And this is stemming from the state's no net loss law. And this means that the town always has to have enough sites to satisfy its RENA. Because we can't always predict how the market will react, it's prudent to build in a bit of a buffer just in case some of the sites we've targeted don't actually develop as we expected, perhaps at a lower density, for example. So we build in a little bit of a buffer to give ourselves some wiggle room here. And the general suggestion for a buffer is 20%. This is supported by the HCD as well as our housing element consultants. So this is the second line. You see the numbers are a little bit elevated to reflect that 20% buffer. So we also know when you scan down to type, we have pipeline projects. So those are units that we know are sort of forthcoming, that are in the hopper. They're either approved and about to begin development, or they're under review, under planning entitlement review currently. So those are rough numbers that we've earmarked there. We've also made an estimate of ADUs based on past years of construction in town, what we think we're going to see in this next cycle. And you might recall, we talked about this at one of our past meetings. There's a way to assign ADUs according to affordability. There's sort of the standard allocation, and then there's a more conservative approach. And our planning consultants have suggested to us that we assume that fewer ADU units will actually be affordable based on what we've seen in the town and practicality, how ADUs are actually being used in town. So again, we've used a more conservative affordability approach for ADUs. So that's why you see, for example, we're estimating only 4 ADUs will be very low income units. We also have our affiliated housing sites, and those are small numbers of units on institutional lands. And we heard a lot more about that in our last meeting. So we've got some numbers earmarked there. And then of course, our housing sites inventory, we're in the middle of deciding this now. So that's why that line is zeroed out until we actually do have direction back from this committee on how we want to choose those sites. So then we make our way to the bottom of the chart here and we see additional housing needed. So how we get to this number is we take our arena with the 20% buffer built in. We back out the number of projects that we know about, the pipeline, the ADUs that we have an estimate for, the affiliated housing sites, and this is what we're left with. So we see here at the bottom, we need 64 very low units, 7 low income units, 17 moderate income, 84 above mod. So that's what we're looking at right now. So when we talk about affordable housing sites, the state allows that any site on our inventory zoned for 20 dwelling units per acre or more, this will automatically count as 100% affordable. So this means any site, for any site to be counted as affordable, it must be minimum density of 20 dwelling units per acre. As committees make their way through the sites analysis, they should be aware of the density trade-off. The denser the site, the higher the unit yield. This means we'll need fewer sites. So for example, if the committee selects a site density of 30 dwelling units per acre, or includes more sites at that density or even a higher density, we're just going to need fewer sites. And there's a benefit to that, of having to rezone fewer sites, but you're going to look at a denser site. So perhaps the committee wants to think about more sites at a lower density. So the committee also needs to consider non-affordable housing sites. So we're looking at moderate income and above moderate income as well. And so we've got 17 and 84 units respectively that we need to look at. So here again, the committee could select a lower density, perhaps 20 dwelling units per acre for these sites, but the density trade-off will still kick into play here. So we have to think about that. So we could look at less density, maybe 10 dwelling units per acre, but we're going to need more sites if we're going to be able to satisfy these moderate and above moderate income units. So again, this is just a little snapshot. This comes out of the chart that we were just reviewing. What we're looking at right now, we need 64 very low income units, 7 low income, 17 moderate, and 84 above moderate units. This is what we're talking about tonight. So where do we go from here? We're going to return to our mapping exercise. As mentioned in the staff memo in tonight's packet, we've taken another look at our mapping. We worked with our consultant urban planning partners to beef up our maps. And now what we're going to look at this evening is the flood zone map, the ground movement potential map, the fault map, the slope map, and the evacuation map. And the evacuation map includes parcels with a single evacuation route. So again, all the maps depict scenarios B and C, site scenarios B and C, and all of these maps are included in your packet. So if you want to take a look at that while we go through, that'd be great. So now I'm going to pass it over to Carla Violet from Urban Planning Partners. She's going to take us through this exercise and we'll go through one map at a time just to refresh all the committee members. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then Carla, you can jump in when you're ready.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. Good evening. Nice to be here, and thanks for having us tonight. Just to start off, as Adrienne mentioned, there are 6 maps for each of the site scenarios B and C showing different hazard constraints. And before starting, I just wanted to point out that there was a slight discrepancy between the slope maps that we prepared and then what was described in the Deer Creek Resources memo. We mapped a 30-degree slope as a constraint, and Zeke actually recommended avoiding building on slopes over 20%, where there's natural vegetation that could create higher wildfire hazard risk. So I know that he pointed out in his memo 20% isn't an absolute number, but I wanted to flag that discrepancy. And when we get to that map, I can kind of point out that there wouldn't really be much of a difference. One of the scenarios is impacted by steeper slopes, so I will point that out once we get to that map. So with that, I will share my screen and hopefully you all can see that okay. Great. All right, so we'll go one by one here. The first composite maps, they represent hazards and development constraints related to flood, soil stability, fault, slopes, and evacuation routes, as Adrian mentioned. There are other hazards like dam inundation or wildfire that are either not applicable in Portola Valley or they are being studied in greater detail. So we haven't yet prepared those. So the darker the gray, that represents multiple constraints where they overlap. So note that all of these constraints, they don't outright ban development, but they would limit the feasibility or the capacity for development. So both portions of scenarios B and C sites would be limited by one constraint. So this is right now site scenario B. You can see a little bit of shading in number 1. And then for site scenario C, there's also some shading in area 1 here in the zoom in. So I'm going to next go to the flood maps that we prepared, starting out with scenario B. So these maps identify zones with 1% annual chance of flood as identified by FEMA. So that means that a flood event that has a 1 in 100 chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. So development within these areas are subject to additional requirements and review. And just looking at both site scenarios B and C, there are no sites currently impacted by the 1% annual chance of flooding. So next, I'm going to take us to soil stability. We identified areas where soil types are known to be less stable based on the town's ground movement potential map. So there are soil types that are shown that restrict or disallow new development according to town resolution number 2746 adopted in 2017. So we have site scenario B here, as well as site scenario C. Fortunately, none of those areas are currently impacted by the least stable soil types. Okay, and for faults, let me start off with B again. So we prepared these two maps showing known faults, which is the San Andreas fault, which runs through Portola Valley. And the town geologic map and the ground movement potential map identify required setbacks for occupied buildings around this fault, and that's what's shown in the pink areas. We're not showing any other mapped faults where geologic investigation is required for development with 100 feet, within 100 feet, excuse me. And out of our two scenarios, only site scenario B in this number 1 zoom in area shows some constraints there. And I'll show you for scenario C, there are no areas within that fault zone. Okay. Our next hazard constraint is slopes. And here is for site scenario B. As I mentioned before, we mapped steep slopes that are greater than 30 degrees, and that was using the town's geologic data. Zeke recommends actually not building on slopes greater than 20 degrees. For site scenario B, there isn't any issue with steep slopes, even at the 20% level. However, in site scenario C, there is an area that's already impacted up here in number 1. So that area is has some overlap with slopes greater than 30 and 20%. So it just means there would be less area available for development. So we'd need to look at that more closely. And last but not least, we have the evacuation routes maps. And there's 2 maps here for both scenarios. State law actually requires that jurisdictions identify residential developments in hazard areas that do not have at least 2 emergency evacuation routes. I'm sure most of you have heard that already, but parcels in the yellow are considered constrained because they are located along single access roadways. And that just means there's only one route in and out. For right now, we're showing that both site scenarios B and C. So here is B and then C, excuse me, the last map here. Both of those areas are not currently impacted by single access roadways. So this concludes kind of the overview of the maps in your packet. And obviously I'm here to help answer questions, as is Zeke. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Carla. So I'm just gonna switch back. I just have a couple more slides. I'm just gonna have to scroll through here to pick that back up. Just one second. Okay. So for next steps, just in terms of how this discussion will flow, we'll move to questions from staff and consultants from the committee, and then we'll do our public comment, and then we're going to get down into committee discussion. And so what do we want committee discussion to look like? We want the committee to have a comprehensive discussion around multifamily sites, and that includes the very low and low income affordable units. Again, there's that default density of 20 dwelling units per acre or greater to be considered 100% affordable. And then of course we have moderate and above moderate income units that we need to plan for as well. We're hoping that this discussion will be focused enough for the committee to make a detailed recommendation by the end of its next meeting. And this meeting, of course, is next Monday on the 28th. We planned this intentionally just so that all the information was fresh for the committee to keep the discussion going. It's a lot of comprehensive stuff, and we understand that. And that's why we've got these back-to-back meetings. So this is what we want the committee to focus in on as they sort of kick off their discussion this evening. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to you, Jocelyn. Thank you. Jocelyn, you're muted still.
All right. I don't know why I'm mute. There's nobody here with me right now. But I'm just like going through this exercise. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Carla, for all the information. It's great to set everything up. I guess, Adrian, do you want to go take questions from the committee and the town and then go to the discussion?
Yeah,
do it that way?
Exactly. So questions from the committee to staff and consultants. Let's start there.
Okay.
And then we can move to the public comment.
Okay. And then we'll go back to the discussion period. All right. Sounds good. And at the end of the discussion period, I want to do kind of a poll, everybody on the committee, and kind of see where we're resting in terms of the choices that we've got before us. Okay. So let's go to questions first. Amy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Through the chair, I actually have a question for, I think for Zeke Lunder, or someone from Deer Creek. I read through the Deer Creek summary, and I noted that the summary said the 20% slope restriction was not absolute. And I was hoping maybe we could hear some more about what the mitigating factors might be that would allow for development on a slope of 20 degrees.
Zeke, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Okay, thanks. It's good to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, good to be back. So as a firefighter, the thing about slopes that we really look out for is we don't want to be fighting fire at the top of a slope. And so things that are built at the toe of a slope, oftentimes the slope is not as critical a factor. So, and Carla mentioned that we've talked about 30% slope. We started with 30% slope mapping from the town, the geologic risk hazard. And so I've got a map here that shows the difference between areas that are 20% slope and 30% slope. And we've talked about areas with less than 20% slope being generally safer. You can see that these areas that are gray here are less than 20% slope. The reason that I like to use 20% slope instead of 30% is that if you build right up to the 30% slope, usually it means that you're right at the top of the steepest part of the hill. And so we call that the shoulder of the slope. And so it's just a more conservative approach that, if we say, yeah, go ahead and build on 20% slope and you're looking right here, that puts the house right at the top of this steep gully. When I say the slope's not absolute, I mean that sometimes you can mitigate the hazard that's posed by the vegetation. And sometimes the slope just might be covered with, large oak trees with grass underneath and might not really have a critical fire hazard at all. So want to qualify that, we're worried about steep slopes that are covered with heavy vegetation in particular, and mainly because the steep slope makes it really hard to manage the vegetation. So the example that Carla gave of a slope constraint on this group of parcels along Alpine Road is that this is the toe of the slope, and that the back of this parcel has 30% slopes, and lower down we've got 20% slopes. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't build on the toe of the slope, because we're more worried about fire going up the hill. We're not as worried about fire burning downhill into these houses. So though we have these areas that are constrained by slope, that doesn't mean that we couldn't build a ways up the hill there if you had the access to yard the material out. Another thing about managing vegetation is that when you cut down a big tree, it's heavy and it's hard to carry up the hill. And so generally, if we have access to the bottom of the hill, we can maintain the vegetation better. So what I said in my report is just that where we have places where there's difficult access to the bottom of the parcel, that's kind of a red flag. But in general, slope makes a kind of a good corollary or a good surrogate for access. So these areas that are red, that are over 30% slope, we're worried more about access than anything to be able to manage the vegetation.
Okay, thank you. Zeke, I guess, okay. Back to the committee. Al, you got a question, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question more related to the process for the staff. We've talked about scenario B, scenario C. Are these mutually exclusive, or can we do some properties through basically scenario B, and then other properties where we select them based on scenario C? And then also, when I look at the maps, it looks to me like there are a few other properties nearby what we've picked in the scenario B and scenario C that would also be possibilities. And so how wide, how much freedom do we have as we start discussing the site selection?
Great question. Thank you. The properties that we studied were a starting point to be kind of representative of those types of properties. So we needed to give something for them to analyze in the model. So they are not mutually exclusive. You can pick and choose between them. If you thought that there were additional sites that would be appropriate, we could also investigate those. Just because we haven't mapped them so far doesn't mean that they're couldn't be under consideration. So that's why we wanted to give you the whole town and the constraints map. So we highlighted the things we've studied so far But if you wanted to look at the constraints map and see if there are other sites that you thought were appropriate, that would be perfectly acceptable and good for the committee to discuss.
Thanks, Laura. That's helpful.
Right, go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I had a similar question. Remind me, if we chose B or C or both together, does that likely fill out the chart appropriately? If we found that those were acceptable?
If we chose B and C, in terms of like looking at the size of those parcels, we would be in the right ballpark.
Okay.
So what we're hoping is that at the end of this discussion tonight with the committee, we know what direction the committee would like us to go in, and then we can do a little bit of initial analysis and math and bring that back to you at the next meeting, so we could kind of go one step deeper into that analysis and make sure it's going to work.
Okay, that helped. And then my second out of 3 questions is, can you give me a feel for what 20 units per acre and 30 units per acre looks like, 10-story apartment building? That's a joke.
It's not a 10-story apartment building, right? So we've been trying to find good examples of this, and it's a little bit harder than you might think. And so if you are familiar with the Willow Commons Supportive Housing Project, that's 13 units on a little bit more than an acre. We're going to try to pull some either pictures or sketches together for the committee to see. And so if that's something you're really interested in, we could try to pull some examples together for the next meeting. 20 units per acre, you can oftentimes design in such a way that it doesn't feel like a really big apartment. And so you can break it up into smaller pieces. You could do kind of courtyard buildings. The new housing at the Priory is 6 units. And if you view it kind of as you're passing by, it kind of has the massing of one single story of one 2-story house in the community. So if you kind of think, 6 units fits in the footprint of kind of a medium-sized single-family home. If you just, if you're driving by, take a look at that example. I think that's a good way to visualize it. And then depending on how this conversation goes, we can bring back a few more pictures or visualizations for you.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Great. And then my third thing is just a comment. If we do start expanding and looking at others, I noted on the evacuation route map, probably lots of you know that Portola Valley has many gates that are just for, to keep people from driving a certain way through the neighborhoods, but those are intended to use in evacuations. I noted that those were not accommodated or considered in the evacuation. Those many roads with gates, then they do have 2 evacuation routes. I just wanted to point that out. If we expand the thing and we have sites that we'd like to look out at, but they don't have 2 evacuation routes, we should go back and look at the gates in Portola Valley. There's about a dozen.
Yes, and we wanted to, for the purpose of this initial analysis, be really conservative.
Yeah.
And so then we would have to look at how do those gates operate and do they meet those expectations, do you know what I mean, of how the evacuations would work. And also it's both the residents getting out and emergency personnel getting in and trying to make sure we understand that. So very great comment. And so if the committee wanted to look at some of those sites more closely, we'd need to go back and analyze that with our consultants that are doing that part of the work.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's my 3 questions.
Thanks, Anne. Andrew, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. I got 2 quick questions. I got to run off and pick up my dog at the veterinarian. He's got a broken leg or something. But before I run, and then I'll be back on later, on the 20 units per acre, does that automatically qualify it for affordable, or is that a minimum standard, or how does that relate to the affordability? It was unclear to me from the report.
I'm going to ask actually Curtis to elaborate on this one a little bit, if you could.
Certainly. Thank you, Laura. Good question. At 20 units to the acre, that's deemed by the state for your area to be appropriate for affordable housing. So you can designate units within there to be below market rate. And what a lot of communities do is, it's not likely that it may not be 100%, but you could look at the unit allocation in your regional housing needs and allocate units along those similar percentages. But that's within some of the new legislation for allowing communities to utilize that density for affordable housing without having to provide additional information to justify affordability.
Okay, so there's two steps. First, we'd have to find sites that were okay for 20 units per acre. And then we'd have to also say, and we want these to be considered affordable for purposes of our plan. Is that right?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. You find sites and then you designate, you figure out within that site the capacity and units that you would want in each of the income categories.
Okay, then I have a quick question on building on slopes. Does it make a difference whether you build a house into a hill or hanging off a hill? It would seem to me it would on the 20 to 25 degree slope. So can you mitigate simply by building it more into the hill as opposed to, dangling off the hill where your balconies above the brush and all that?
Yeah, in Southern California, some of the newer developments that are being built for fire safety, they kind of look at a setback based on the way that flames kind of lay over at the top of a hill. And so they'll pick a slope-based kind of setback there. I think either way, it's not great to be mid-slope, whether your house is dug in or not. But more importantly is that access issue. Can you make access below the house to actually manage the vegetation?
Okay, well, I'm hanging over a hill and I'm over 20 degrees. That's one of the reasons I asked, but okay, thank you.
Okay, next on the committee, we're just doing clarifying questions right now. Helen Walter.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I have a question about the mapping meeting the furthering the fair housing goals of HCD. I mean, it looks like to me that we're pretty much citing them on two sites, unless I've missed something, which obviously it's a high resource community, but we are supposed to spread affordable housing throughout the community. Is that accurate?
I think it is a matter of perspective. So there's different things for the community to think about. When the HCD staff was here, again, Housing Community Development for people that are newer, when the staff was here, we talked to them a little bit about those issues of fair housing and concentration of units. And they thought, given our environment and the kind of the nature of how the community is laid out, it may be more appropriate to concentrate units here than it would be in a lot of other places. Now, they weren't giving us an approval, but they were saying that they understood in this case that it might make sense to cluster them as opposed to spread them out. We're physically not, do you know what I mean, a big community with different types of neighborhoods in the way, Redwood City has very different types of neighborhoods, and they want those units spread out in those different types of neighborhoods. So if this committee finds it really important to spread more units out, staff could think about additional technical tools that we might use to do that. So an example might be looking at the constraints map. We might create like what we would call an overlay zone or something that considers all of the constraints and we might be able to increase the density to allow, I'm making something up here, townhouse development on certain sites throughout the community that don't have a lot of those physical or safety constraints. So we would really be looking to this committee to tell us if you want to pursue that more actively so that we could provide some proposed solutions for that. But we do think we can make a reasonable case based on the information that we have that these sites would be acceptable for fair housing purposes. And we do have a complete additional fair housing analysis that's coming from consultants that are specially work in this field to help us flesh out the fair housing aspects of the housing element.
Okay, that's good to know because, you know, obviously we don't want anything stigmatized. And the other question I have is I am concerned about the distance and proximity. Obviously, when you get public funding and they, you know, some of these sites have better access to the schools than other sites. So I am concerned. I don't see, you know, obviously the mapping, it looks like was dealt with risk management, basically, when you're dealing with the flood maps and such. But did we do any mapping for, you know, access to public funding for the affordable housing developers?
We did not, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. I think my assumption was that many of these projects would be small enough that they wouldn't be going through some of those larger like tax credit systems to be able to do these types of projects. So if you felt like, you know, that was important for us to consider, we can certainly go back with our team and think about that. The maps that you have in front of you are specifically to think about safety and hazards because we really heard from the council and from this committee and from the community that that was, you know, the most important thing to people. We also recognize the environmental, meaning conservation, you know, biology and plants and animals aspect of this. And so we would be looking for some feedback from the Conservation Committee in that realm. But we haven't taken up any analysis similar to what you're describing, if I'm understanding, Helen.
Right, thanks. And so could you guys could do some sort of analysis to figure out what sites would be more, you know, to make sure that both, you know, if we were to pick both sites, for instance, that both sites would be possibilities, like, or if we pick one that's not a possibility for an affordable housing developer to develop and we get hit, you know, by not meeting the RHNA expectations, right? That would be a problem. Does that?
I'm sorry if I'm not following. There's probably a nuance that I'm not getting to your question. Would you mind asking a different way?
Yeah, sorry if I'm not being clear. So one of these sites that, you know, the one on Portola Road is pretty far from the schools, for instance. It is closer to the library or, you know, things like that to score. So it's far away from, it's not near a pharmacy. It's not near a school. It's not near, so it's not, you know, it's not able to qualify for the tax credits, for example. So it could be more challenging for affordable housing developer to develop it, is what it looks like to me, but I haven't done the full analysis. So my question is, if we pick that site, for example, and then it's not actually buildable, is that, like, how do we make sure that the site that we pick, obviously the mapping you guys have done is fabulous and it's great and it really does the great risk analysis, but I'm worried about the actual building because of the money, if that makes sense. And so like, what happens if we pick the site that's not buildable due to the financing? That's like, I know that's like, so I guess we would need to do the analysis to make sure that they're buildable, I guess.
Yeah, I think we have to think about it kind of in different layers, right? We don't want to choose things that we know are not practical and would never work, right? So we're trying to think about that. But on the flip side, we can't anticipate, do you know what I mean, all of the variables. So we're trying to think, or what are the variables that we need to consider that are most likely to impact? And so I think what we would do in this case is we would go back to our consultant team, both Urban Planning Partners as well as 21 Elements, and understand how other communities are analyzing these types of issues. And if it's just for larger sites, or if we need to do it for smaller sites like this, because we don't want to have something that would be an impediment to development. And I think that's what you're getting at. Like, we don't want to choose things that have impediments that we know about.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Helen. Sarah, go ahead.
My question is for clarity on some remarks that Curtis made. So just so I'm clear, when I'm looking at the slide that you guys shared, slide number 13, that showed the projections by housing type. So does that mean, when you say affordable housing, does that mean if we meet the criteria of 20 units per acre, does that hit the very low unit category?
Yes, it can hit the low and very low unit category. Projects less than that, it could also include market rate in there too, but to be eligible to count towards your low and very low, it needs to be 20 units per acre. Smaller projects under 20 could qualify for some market or moderate rate units along with market rate.
Okay. And then second question, I think might be more for you, Laura, and again, looking at this table on slide 12 and comparing the map scenarios that you had. Are you suggesting that all 150 of these could potentially fit within the three zones across scenario A and B? I'm assuming there's additional locations for like ADUs and what have you, the other line items. Could you clarify that a little bit?
Okay, so we have the areas that were identified in the maps in the bright colors, right, as the different scenarios, B and C. Those, when we just very preliminarily look at those sites and think some of them could be 20 units per acre, some of them may be less. We think we're in the ballpark of getting to that 150 number. So yes, we think we can potentially accommodate those number of units in approximately those sites. You know, maybe a little bit more. We need to look at that, you know, depending on the direction of the committee, we'd look at it a little bit more closely. Depending on if the committee wants to go with a little bit higher density, maybe we don't need exactly that many sites. So that's why we wanted to break it up into two pieces, so that we can hear what direction the committee is going, get the community feedback, and then give you a little bit more analysis.
Well, then as a follow-up to comments that Helen was making, could we also then ask for an additional look at places beyond these areas if we do the constraints overlay, you know, in other areas across town? It might not yield high volume, but it might yield something.
Yeah, if you want to identify specific places or like parts of town, maybe not the exact parcel, but like parts of town that you want us to look at further, we could do that and bring something a little bit more back for you for next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, go to Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, maybe two questions. One is it challenging to identify the range of sites that actually would qualify under the criteria that you've identified, the constraints? That is to say, do you have something like a geocoded mapping system that would be available for us or for you to pretty easily develop a range of maps? Or is this kind of a one-off kind of analysis for you? I'm trying to understand the level of effort and whether there's some sensitivity analysis that we can all do together.
Okay, I'll ask Carla to chime in too if she has additional thoughts. But Urban Planning Partners has a planner on their team, Alyssa, who has been doing this mapping for us and with us. And so she has all of the town's basic GIS layers. And so she's working with them together. And so it is possible, you know, to with those basic parameters to map reasonable things pretty quickly, to be able to do that. Is your question to do it live time together in the committee, or is it you would request things and we would map it for the next meeting?
Well, you know, needless to say, it's always good to see what the full range is, and then to go and play with it in a more dynamic way together, so you can have a conversation about it, if that's a possibility. If it's not if it's a pain in the tuchus to try and to do this in a live manner, then we obviously shouldn't do it. But if you have the data layers and you can simply paste them together in real time and dial them in and change the variables a little bit, that would certainly be interesting. Failing that, simply seeing what the range of seeing the full scope of properties that met the criteria, you know, you can set some.
So Carla, I'm wondering,
But-
have you ever done that kind of thing, kind of more real time with the committee, or how does that, what's the fastest way to do that?
There's a couple communities we've done more interactive real-time mapping. Usually that requires a different platform though, like a different way to do it online, which is usually the easiest way. And there is additional charges that come with that. It's just, it kind of depends on which platform you use. I'm not
So Laura, I
aware
mean,
of-
what's
yeah.
best, do you think, is if our committee kind of got some energy around some other sites in town, we would have you then decide whether you want to go and investigate that and get that mapped?
Yeah, and there is a regional tool from ABAG that might help us to do some of that too. But we'd really have to think through whether it would be effective. What I don't want to do is set an expectation that we could do it live time and be looking at things and then not have the materials that we need.
Sure.
To have a good discussion. So I would say this, while this discussion is going on today, if everyone could sort of keep track of the types of things that they would be looking for, because I am not clear on what that would include. Do you know what I mean? And then maybe at the end of the discussion tonight, we can say, here's some of the things we would be looking for, and then we can give you more feedback on what would be feasible to get together and how we could do that.
Okay.
So Laura, the other part of this is we identified 3 areas here that we looked at together. How did you identify those 3 areas? I think that you probably had some broader sets of criteria in your mind, and I'd be interested to know what do you, how do you see the world? How do you think about this? And Carla, if you've got some insights as well, I'd be interested in that as well.
When we originally submitted these scenarios, so there's all the scenarios that we considered on October 18th. I hope I'm getting that date right, and it was linked in your packet if you don't remember. All of those scenarios we gave to 21 Elements because they were either exploring something someone had said to me in the past, oh, it would be a good idea to do this, or it came just from my general professional planning experience.
Yeah,
So
that's what
we-
I want. I want your general planning experience.
Okay.
What was going on in your head when you
Okay,
said,
so
I am interested in
yeah.
these 3 sites?
Literally what I did was in this, we didn't have it all GIS mapped.
Yeah, yeah.
I printed out all of the maps on a
Right.
big table in front of me and thought about, number one, what's the values of the community, right? Like, what's the town ethos? How do we get in and out of this community? You know, how are slopes and geologic safety and fire safety going to impact this exercise? So I gave 21 elements, some scenarios that would spread the units out, knowing that it would get market rate units, but probably not affordable units. And then I gave them some scenarios that would concentrate the units together, knowing that those had less safety concerns to them and probably had better evacuation. So they modeled all of that. And if you remember, there are some scenarios that would spread out some units. They would result in units. They would be almost exclusively market rate units. And then these were the 2 scenarios that we thought would generate affordable housing units. And then kind of to Helen's earlier point, it's really kind of a philosophical question about whether units should be clustered together or spread out. Even if they're clustered together, it would be a mix of market rate units at affordable. And those units would be located closer to amenities or services or businesses. So there's a very reasonable case to cluster them together according to those 2 scenarios. Philosophically, some people feel differently, that units should be spread out throughout the community. So then you have more mixed income neighborhoods, but lower income residents may not be within walking distance of a store or a school or a park or something, right? So there's different philosophical ways to think about it. So I was trying to bring some best practices and my experience of the community without too much of my, I would call, personal opinion, right? I was trying to bring you best practice.
So is basically meeting the 3 criteria, safety criteria that we were talking about, maybe 4, 3, and then large enough sites so that you could actually get some numbers in addition to getting the densities that we are after in order to be able to hit all ranges. And then also looking to place them in areas that were already urbanized with amenities in the surrounding. And that's how we came up with the 3 locations.
Yes, that's a very good summary.
All right, cool. Just a final question, and then I will sit down. And that is, if we're thinking about like 20 dwelling units per acre, I'm thinking like 2-story, maybe 3-story townhomes.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, you
Yeah.
can get to stack kind of product, but they're kind of
Yes.
townhome-ish. Not as dense as you can go, but it's like a medium dense townhome product.
Yeah, so it's like townhouses, or it might be small clusters. Do you know what I mean? A few units together and then another building with a few units together, right? Something like that on a lot of our sites. I would say 2 to 3 stories is probably right for that kind of density.
It'd be super helpful to have some pictures of what that kind of, and I hate to say it, but that kind of product looks like. Our friends over in Menlo Park, I know, have a couple of different varieties that look a little bit like that, and that might be interesting. If we're looking at things like duplexes, we're talking about maybe 8 dwelling units per acre, 10 dwelling units per acre.
Duplexes, I mean, right, it's all a little bit relative. I've worked in communities where single family is 8 units per acre. Single family is 5,000 square foot lot. So a lot of San Mateo County, 8 units per acre is single family. And so we're trying to find some examples that kind of would resonate and hit the high standard. But your point is very well taken. So we'll definitely work on that to try to bring some illustrations or pictures back.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Nicholas. All right, Bob Turcott, you're next.
Thank you. A couple questions for Laura. The material makes reference to R3 zoning, and forgive me if that's been defined before, but could you remind us what that means?
It's just a stand-in to say zoning that is a little bit more dense than single family. So a lot of places have R1 being single family, R2 being kind of duplex development, and R3 being something more than duplexes, but less than high density apartments. So we were just using that kind of as a planning term to say it's sort of a medium to medium low density housing product.
Okay, it doesn't exist legally yet in Portola Valley, correct?
No, it would have to be created as part of this process.
Okay, so it's sort of a placeholder for that.
Yeah.
There's a handful of associated thrust faults associated with the San Andreas Fault, and I didn't see them depicted on the map, and I was wondering if that was an oversight or if it wasn't, they were intentionally left off, and where they lie. I actually don't know where they lie, but I know there are, you know, a small handful of them.
The map includes the main parts of the fault and the fault setbacks. When we get to the point of having more of a defined site inventory, we would still be running that past the town geologist and his role as an advisory role for this process. So I think we would pick up any issues that come from there. But we didn't want to map things that we didn't feel like we could accurately convey to the committee for this process.
Okay. Sort of along the lines of what Helen was asking for, I too would like to see or get some exposure to the market feasibility analysis. It's hard for me to, I feel very uncomfortable not having a sense of how practical some of these developments are that we're talking about in terms of, you know, whether financially, whether they be feasible going forward. And I was wondering if that's something that will, you know, get some exposure to at some point in this process.
The market feasibility analysis came through the big model that 21 Elements did with another consultant team. They ran all of these scenarios for most of the cities in San Mateo County. Not all of them participated in this. So it's all coming from one model. So it uses county-wide assumptions that are going to vary a little bit. And it's HCD has said that they think that that feasibility is acceptable. So this sort of feasibility analysis is pretty new in terms of housing element planning. I mean, and in advanced planning in general in my field. I mean, when I started, we didn't do any economic analysis. We just drew colors on maps and waited, and nothing happened. And so adding economic, you know, feasibility has become kind of more mainstream in the last 10 years or so. But this is really, to my knowledge, the first housing element where we've had to take this kind of feasibility analysis to this level. So HCD has said that what we've done is sufficient. And I'm inclined to go with what 21 Elements recommends if HCD thinks that it's sufficient. It's not perfect. There are aspects of the model that are a little bit blunt. But if people will accept it, then I think that should be a good answer. If you're interested in some of the assumptions that go into that, maybe we could get you some of those offline, but we weren't going to get the whole committee into those details.
So can we sort of take for granted that, you know, a cluster of townhouses would be economically feasible along Portola Road or Alpine Road? I mean, should that be a working assumption on our part?
I recommend that as your working assumption. Their model says that the projects would pencil, at least with a broad brush. Do you know what I mean? Not very specifically, but generally. And this is sort of important for the community to start to understand as we start to work through this. One of the reasons that these projects would pencil is because single family, if we rezoned to multifamily, single family would no longer be allowed. And single family housing is becoming increasingly valuable and is becoming harder to come by. And so sometimes a single family development is actually more lucrative than a small multifamily development. And so we would be taking single family out of the mix. And so then that site would only be available for multifamily development in the future. And so it changes the economics a little bit of that site. And so I'm not an expert in this field. I'm relying on the experts to inform me, but that is the gist of what they've told us about some of these sites. So we do think broad brush that these projects will work based on that model. And I do think we should go with that assumption for the purpose of this committee.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions for Zeke Ludner as well. Zeke, if you're with us, there you are. Handful of questions. One, your report you characterize as a cursory survey, and I was wondering if you were given sort of unlimited time and unlimited budget, what would you do? What do you see as being important to do further if budget and time weren't an issue?
I think the work that the district is looking into doing is it's a good step. You know, we just did similar work in Chico, and having really detailed fuels data is really important as far as prioritizing areas for treatments. For the purpose of this particular effort, it seems pretty cut and dry that the units that are being proposed by the planners pretty much fall into areas that we don't need a lot more additional mapping to know their hazard. They're kind of in the lowest hazard areas in the community. And so I think if if we were trying to sneak, well, sneak's not the right word, but if we were trying to put a bunch of apartment buildings right in the middle of the community on top of a hill, we'd need a lot more detailed hazard data to develop priority projects for evacuation, et cetera. But I think that the nature where they're proposing projects, we don't need a lot more detailed information to say that, well, those are the best places from a wildfire standpoint that we've got to work with.
One of my concerns is, Fire Marshal Bullard spoke a lot about hazard and risk assessment, hazard and risk, two different components to evaluate safety. And it looks, by my reading, it looks like your analysis has been focused mostly on hazard. What's the likelihood of a development placed in a given location being subjected to wildfire? What's the danger to that development? But the risk part of it is also an important analysis, and it's mandated by the state. And the risk looks at, not the likelihood that new development will burn, but assuming it does burn, what risk does it impose on the community? And so, I'm not a professional, but what you're saying fits with my intuition that if the development is at the bottom of a hill, that's a low hazard location for the development, but that development is also imposing risk on the neighborhood. And so, to my thinking, the proposal sort of towards Ladera on Alpine Road at the bottom of those hills actually pose more of a risk to the community than Nathorst Triangle, which is not by a hill, in terms of either if those developments burned, since they're at the bottom of the hill down on Alpine. So that's the component that I'm a little uneasy about. The fire district will be formally looking at hazard and risk, but I don't see a characterization of risk so much. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
I think that's a good point, that when we talk about hazard mitigation, we're also, a lot of the activities we undertake for hazard mitigation are also risk mitigation. So when you mow the weeds around a house, you're protecting it from wildfire, but you're also reducing the likelihood that if the house catches on fire, it will escape up the hill.
Right.
And so those concepts are somewhat interchangeable, that the work that you're going to do to mitigate the hazard when you build the development is also going to help to mitigate the hazard, or to mitigate the risk posed by that structure. I think, it's kind of interesting. Historically, you look at why we have CAL FIRE. Originally, CAL FIRE's job was to protect the forest from house fires. And now it's flipped, and CAL FIRE's job is to protect homes from forest fires. But those two go together, and I think it's part of what, when we talk about, overall fire safety in the community, and Don's talking about adopting these codes. There's state codes on weed abatement that, if chosen to be enforced, they really are a powerful tool to keep something like a house fire from taking out the whole neighborhood. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that new construction is kind of like a new car. My insurance went down when I bought a car that had lane detection alarms on it, because new cars are safer. And so when we build a new housing development, it's less likely to burn than an old house.
Yeah, I don't disagree. The point I'm making, though, is that the risk dimension looks a little unaddressed to me. That's the only point I'm making. I do have a couple of questions that are a little bit involved, shall I say. Jocelyn, if you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen briefly. It will make it a lot
I'm
more
not, do you mind just asking your questions, please?
They're based on maps, and they're very visually intensive, and it would be very helpful if I could share my screen.
Do you think we can refer to the maps that have been shared already?
No.
All right, well,
These are
here's the thing. I'm
loading
concerned about time too, Laura. I just want to do a check-in with you. What I want to do is get the committee into really looking at the scenarios that you've presented, B and C, and maybe show those and delve into actually the lots, what's there, and kind of delve into details about the scenarios that have been presented, and see if at the end of the meeting we can kind of get some comfort around those, or have other questions and even ask about other properties.
I've got some
I wanna
concerns
get-
about issues that haven't been raised. I'd like to ask our consultant, and it'd be much more effective if I could simply share the screen. If you
Hold on a sec. I want to just go back to Laura for a minute in terms of how we're going to move forward. So Laura, do you think we can do that in terms of really delving into scenario B and C and kind of testing those as viable options for us to consider?
Yeah, we really want to look at those two scenarios and see if the committee thinks those are the right scenarios.
Yeah.
Combination of the two, those plus parcels, those minus parcels, something different.
Yeah.
Right? We do want to get to that point tonight.
Yeah.
So I would say that it would be good to kind of keep the discussion pointed towards that
Yeah,
goal.
I want to move to that as fast as we can. Bob, do you think you could quickly ask your questions, or else can we table it for another time?
We would literally spend less time on the screen I want to share than we've already spent talking about it. And
All right, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I appreciate it. Do you see it?
Now there's a map there, yes. Fuel
Okay.
load. uh-huh.
I will skip the associated slides and just jump to this one, which shows both the vegetative fuel and the structural fuel. Structural fuel being almost 1,000 times greater than the amount of vegetative fuel. And my question, Zeke, if you'll hold on to your answer, because there's one more thing I want to show you, but my question here is, should we not consider the evacuation capacity and the impact that a community like Ladera, which is very dense And if the scenario that you described as being most likely, catastrophic fire coming from the east, these residents will have to get out quickly. Should that influence our thinking? And then the other question I have is over here, also showing structural fuel in another neighborhood. This is a photo I showed you last time. CAL FIRE requires 20-foot road widths in very high hazard areas. This is 14.5 feet wide with overhanging vegetation, wooden power poles with power lines. It's less than 20 degrees, and it's not considered an evacuation hazard. And yet, when you were here last time, you said that you wouldn't build there. And so my question to you is, this question is, what sort of analysis should be done so we can identify areas like that when we're thinking about where we can safely put structures? Those are my two questions for you based on those images. Jocelyn, thank you for letting me show them.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Yeah. So the second one, the mapping that the chief wants to do, that fire marshal wants to do, is going to be good for helping address the site-specific hazards that you identified, like the scary, dense, overgrown road that you show the picture of.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as east wind scenario, and whether or not we consider that, anything you do, you should be considering thinning out as wide as possible along Alpine and Portola roads out to the full extent of the right of way. And that is going to require people to not be in love with every single tree.
I was really asking about the evacuation issue.
Right. Yeah. So no matter what you do, the town needs to improve the evacuation route, and that will make it safer for everyone to get in and out. If the question is if Ladera is going to choke up the road and everyone's going to die in Portola Valley, I don't think that's going to happen, but it'll be less likely to happen if you cut brush along your main roads in and out.
Really, my question is, should we favor the Portola Road site over the Alpine Road site based on that concentrated
You should do
density?
both of them.
Do all three sites, is that what you're saying?
All the main roads in and out of town, you should open them up as much as possible out to the right of way. I wouldn't prioritize one over the other.
No, I wasn't asking about vegetation clearance. I was asking about siting new development. And I'm wondering if, given that concentration in Ladera, are we better off avoiding more development on Alpine and favoring placing it on Portola Road? That's really what I was trying to get at.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, I've got a question. The town, are you guys undertaking an evacuation study? And I'm just curious, if so, what's the update on that and how does that information dovetail to what we're looking at?
Laura, do you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Hi, Jeremy Dennis, town manager. Let me turn my camera on, and I apologize if my background's a little, my background is fine. Thought you're going to see cats and dogs in the menagerie here. The town is conducting an evacuation study with Fair and Piers and their traffic consultant. That process started in the September-October timeframe. A lot of data collection that's actually continuing with the latest information from Sequoias and Windmill and a few other locations. We're hoping for product to come out in the April-ish timeframe. Things have been extended a little bit to get this additional information. The level of detail that we're talking about here would likely come from a further study. The purpose of this study was to do three things: meet statutory requirements under state law. Secondly, determine the length of time under different scenarios, turning roads on and off it would take to evacuate the community, including environs directly outside the community. And number three, looking at any potential improvements we can make in the right-of-way infrastructure otherwise. So I would not be surprised if there was a determination to conduct some additional work that was much more site-specific on particular roads and the like. Thank you.
So April timeframe, we'll have some evacuation information that'll we'll be able to just review as we're considering sites and finalizing things for our recommendation.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is I don't know if it will have value to the committee in the way that I think is being discussed right now, because it's not site specific. But I'll work with the consultant, and there's also a subcommittee of members of the Wildfire Preparedness Committee that are looking at this as well. So I'm actually talking to the consultant tomorrow, so I can see if there's something there. And if we do determine that it's useful, we'll bring it to you, but it'll be a public document anyway. So
yeah,
welcome to
and I
look at
mean, relating it to the scenarios we're considering would be helpful if that's possible. Yeah, thanks.
Well,
Thanks
and
for the update.
a big part of evacuation planning right now is this first step that you already have, which is identifying the sites that only have one way in or out. So
Right.
that map is already in your constraints map. And so that's the one that we identified as really important for the sites inventory discussion.
Okay.
And then when we get to discussions about, kind of really fine grain like ADUs and SB9 units, maybe that is going to be impacted more by the fine grain analysis that comes a little bit later.
Okay.
So we're hoping that what you have in front of you now is, most of what you need to be able
Yeah.
to talk about a site inventory.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. I have a follow-on question to Bob's question about building at the bottom of a slope. And it was just reminding me of the discussion we had last, well, I don't know when it was, with Dawn and Zeke present. And we were talking about the Stanford project, which is at the bottom of a slope. And my takeaway was, and I guess Zeke, I just want to know if this is right or not, is if the trees there are, there's no underbrush and it's cleared and it's grass, that building with kind of modern building codes and materials and all that, that's not introducing kind of a, I guess, very dangerous project in our town. Is that right?
Well, I mean, people start fires, right? And if you have more people on the landscape, more fires start. And so everything, when we talk about hazard mitigation, I think Bob made a good point that we need to talk about risk mitigation too. So if you thin and maintain an area around a structure, then it both keeps a structure fire from becoming a wildfire, and it keeps a wildfire from becoming a structure fire. And a kind of flip side to the amount of people, more people on the land, more fires start, more people on land see fires quicker, fires get reported sooner, and they get put out. So I think it's the two go together, the hazard and risk. And at the scale that you're talking about, I don't see, just to come back to Bob's, until the evacuation concerns associated with putting a few more people in the community. In the scenario that, in the worst case scenario, like evacuation is going to be a disaster for everyone. It does, and it's like, if you're stuck in a wildfire, does it matter if there's 10 cars in front of you versus 11? Like, you guys have wildfire problems that you need to mitigate. You need to mitigate the hazards in your community, whether people build new homes or not.
Mm-hmm.
Portola Road and Alpine Road need work right now to be safer in case of a bad fire.
Mhm.
And so that needs to happen whether or not you've got another 100 residents.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Eric, I saw your hand up earlier. Do you want to ask any clarifying questions at this point? You're muted, I think. Eric, you have to unmute at the bottom left there.
You're not muted, Eric, but we still can't hear you.
Oh. Yeah, Eric, we're not able to hear you. I'm not sure why. Yeah. Do you have any suggestions as a workaround?
Eric, the only other thing to do is to call in also on your phone and do the, if your audio is not working, do the audio on your phone. So phone numbers on the agenda, on the front of the agenda. Because we can't hear you now. Now it says you are muted, but before it said you weren't muted, but we still couldn't hear you.
So Eric, if you don't mind calling in on the phone also, and go to the front of your agenda packet, call the number, because I definitely want you, as we're diving into the details. Okay, I think we're ready to do quick questions from the community.
I have one quick question. Could I
Burning
just-
question, go ahead.
Thanks. Have we gotten any SB9 applications at all, which I really strongly doubt because of
No.
the economics? Thank you.
I guess my one quick question that I had, on the breakout of the units for the above moderate units, there's 84. Can we assume that some chunk of that is going to be just homes that are built in the normal course of, business in Portola Valley? Or do we need to actually pick sites where those would be?
A few of those will be developed in the normal course of business. Of
Yeah.
just single family, a little bit of development happens.
Yeah.
But we don't have very many actually vacant sites. And we don't have very many sites that we think are likely to have lot splits and new homes developed.
Okay.
So we think that number is going to be pretty low. So in terms of, we have sites where people demolish a house and rebuild a new house on that site.
Yeah.
But actually net new single family homes is only a couple per year typically.
Okay. So we're going to have to do multifamily buildings for above moderate is what
Yes.
the data is showing.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Okay, so let's go to the community. We're taking clarifying questions right now based on the presentations. And then, so why don't we go to Karen Askey?
And I'm sorry, through the chair, they should be
Yeah.
giving comments primarily. So
Okay.
things that the community wants the committee to consider in their discussion. So we don't necessarily want to do a lot of back and forth questions tonight,
Thank
since the
you.
purpose is mostly about committee discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Okay, Karen Askey.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Well, I do have a question regarding the chart. And I apologize because I wasn't able to make the October 18th meeting, but I read in the Menlo Park flyer that was sent out that you can reuse current housing element sites. And number one, I'm wondering if Portola Valley has any of those already that didn't get developed that we could put into the plan. And I thought that there were some affiliate sites that perhaps could be there. I was also wondering where the Willow Commons project was falling in that chart, because I know there's 11 units, but I didn't really see that that number in there. So I was a little confused, or the town center. So, and then do we absolutely have to be building to that 20% buffer, or is that just a nice to have so we could look at lower units? Those are sort of all of my questions together, just regarding all those numbers. And I don't know if you want to respond or you want me to just go with my comments now.
All right, so Laura, the Willow Commons, where does that appear in the numbers?
If you want, I can just take them in order real quick.
Yeah.
In terms of current sites, most communities have a lot more existing sites in their housing element inventory that are more meaningful. Ours didn't really identify very many larger sites that we can reuse. Stanford is one of them, but the others, it was not really the same kind of housing inventory as other communities have. So it's not particularly useful for us. We have to start from scratch.
What about Sequoias and Priory? I thought you mentioned there were units there as well.
So those are
in that.
unaffiliated. So I was just going to get
Oh,
there.
all
So
right, thank you.
Willow Commons is included in pipeline projects. Willow Commons is approved. So that is a pretty sure thing. We expect them to go forward. Pipeline projects also includes at this time the Stanford Faculty Housing Project at the Wedge. We don't know if that will go forward, but it is the best practice to include it for now. And then in terms of affiliated housing, the 2 lines below that, affiliated housing sites, we added our best guess based on the feedback that we got from our affiliated housing partners at the last meeting. So we added 5 very low, 5 low, and 12 moderate income units based on the feedback we heard from them. And then in terms of the 20% buffer, in order to get the housing element certified, we do expect to have a buffer, a reasonable buffer. 20% is a pretty good best practice. Some cities are doing more than 20%. If we don't comply with those requirements, we have to go back almost right away and start rezoning more sites. So we'd have to go through all of this process all over again. So we do have to include some kind of buffer, and we think that 20% is the right amount to include.
Okay, thank you. And then Jocelyn, can I just give a few comments now? I know that in the Committee of Committees report from Judith Murphy, there was a strong desire to make sure that we spread this housing out. And I would love to see the results from the survey that was just sent out to see what residents think and really take that into consideration. And I would like to see this spread out. And I think that means trying to figure out how to be more creative and look at some other options as you guys move forward. And last, I am concerned about if we have a lot of density on Alpine and we have a fire come from the east, I think we just need to make sure that we can look at an evacuation plan that involves that Alpine being closed, perhaps that everybody has to go out Portola. So thank you. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I mean, I think when we dig into looking at the specifics on these scenarios, we can talk about the clustering versus not.
So through the chair, I have a recommendation. We do have the timer going tonight. We've asked people to stay to 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So what I'd recommend for speakers is to give your comments and ask your questions all in your 2 minutes. And then through the chair, I'll answer, and staff and consultants can answer the questions that we can. But let's speakers stay to the 2 minutes and do it all at once so we can keep things moving.
Sounds good. All right, Nan Shostak, go ahead.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Great, okay, thank you. I'm on the Geologic Safety Committee, and I'm a bit concerned about the geologic mapping, the geologic hazards, which are not being taken into consideration. Laura mentioned that she left the San Andreas Fault with a 100-foot setback on the map, but the other places in town with known faults are not on the map. And I'm particularly concerned about the Monte Vista Fault that runs across Alpine Road at Las Trancas Road, runs through the Alpine Swim and Tennis Club. It was trenched, they found the fault, and they required a setback when they rebuilt the club buildings. So, and that runs through town, that runs up through Golden Hills. So anything built near there would require setbacks, and you'd have to consider not building. So if you wanted to build there, it might not be possible. Another thing is I'm very, very concerned about the 4 lots between the Ladera boundary and Westridge Drive. As you identified, the backs of the lots have steep slopes, and they're in the state of California earthquake hazards required investigation zone for landslides. But the fronts of the lots are in the liquefaction zone, which also are in the required zone of investigation. So you've got liquefaction, which means that buildings can sink into the ground in a strong earthquake. And if you're building densely, then you're putting heavy buildings on unconsolidated materials, and it's not a good idea. So, I mean, there are things that can be done to strengthen strengthen the ground to mitigate the soil, but that might be very expensive. So I'm just saying that those lots may not be geologically the ideal place to look for to put dense housing.
Okay, thank you, Nan. thank you for your comments. That's helpful. Judith Murphy.
Okay, thanks very much. I have just a couple of comments. One is that I would encourage you not to spend a lot of time choosing between B and C. I think you should be looking at B plus C. That helps spread things out a little bit. It avoids creating a certain type of neighborhood in one part of town that is desirable not to concentrate people too closely. It puts some of the development down at the Woodside Inn and unburdens the Alpine corridor, as people have been talking about. And there also seems to be very arbitrary cutoffs for where the perimeters of the B and C areas are, that the lots right next door to them seem to be essentially identical to the ones that are in the bright colors. So I'm not sure how you decided exactly where those, what would be in B and what would be just outside of B. And the other big thing for me is that multifamily is a very big category, and there's a huge difference between a triplex and an apartment building. And the conversations need to get more precise as we move along so that you don't end up generating opposition that you wouldn't otherwise have because people think they're going to get an apartment house next door when in fact they're going to get a triplex or a quadplex next door. Those are huge differences and need to be made clear as you go along. And then I just want to put back on the table again that we're talking about development along the main corridors, which are the scenic corridors as well. And so you need to always be careful that as we do density there, which we have to do, I understand that it needs to be done in a way that doesn't just totally ruin the aesthetic of the town. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. All right, next comment, Karen. What is your last name, Karen, please?
This is Karen Batra. We need to be very careful and specific on a lot by lot basis. Qualifies as the highest hazard area for steep slopes in regard to housing. Steep slopes can be quite hazardous, especially with geographical features such as canyons and ravines of significant length and exaggerated when the property owner chooses not to maintain their vegetation. But in a lot of cases, just because a lot has a steep slope doesn't mean that additional housing cannot occur or that the lot is a significant fire risk. For example, on Hillbrook, many of the 1 acre lots have steep slopes in the back, over 20% of about 100 to 200 feet. At the bottom of the lot, the land is relatively flat and at the level of Alpine and Portola Road. Fortunately, most of these back lots are filled with oaks or simply grassland. The initial cost to clear the land is not inexpensive, but affordable to most Portola Valley homeowners. The cost is because the crew needs to climb up and carry all that material to dispose of the vegetation, but the subsequent maintenance is quite reasonable. Although the situation, when analyzed from an aerial view, may seem very hazardous from the ground level, in fact, it is not. Most of these lots are park-like, using Ray Moritz's terminology. I've spoken to several fire experts, and they all concur that these shorter, steep slopes are not an issue if they're well maintained. The fire crews have long enough hoses, and most often there's a fire hydrant close enough. Making the requirement to safely navigate a vehicle to the bottom of the property is overkill. When I was on the wildfire committee, I proposed that we need to extend our defensible space at 200 feet for slopes greater than 30%. We need to have that requirement as soon as possible. I'm trying to go really super fast here. I think the policy on the steep slopes for housing needs to be very nuanced. Here are some of the ideas to begin this discussion. Quickly add the 200-foot requirement for defensible space on steep slopes in the WFPD fire code. The steep slope requirement needs to be enforceable with teeth, billing any violators with the cost to clean up their property. Analyze what areas in town that are particularly dangerous with canyons and long steep slopes and mark them appropriately as places where additional structures should not be added. Require a fire hydrant be available to a certain distance away from any proposed ADU. Analyze the distance from a fire truck to the structure in question before approval. Require removal of any eucalyptus or pine trees anywhere on the property. ADUs in cases with enough setback from the steep slope or at the bottom of a steep slope. If an ADU or building is added in these cases, require an annual vegetation inspection with enforceable language. So I know this goes beyond the housing element, but there's a much bigger picture than just, saying a steep slope and
Karen,
statistically.
I'm sorry. I appreciate all these comments. It's very thoughtful. Your 2 minutes is up. Can you just kind of wrap it up?
I'm done.
Thank you. Great job. All right.
Can I make a suggestion through the chair? If people
Yeah.
have written comments, you can send them to staff and we can distribute them to the committee so they can read them. So Karen, if you would send those to housing@portolavalley.net, we can distribute. Thank you.
That was
Okay,
great.
thank
I appreciate, I agree with everything you said.
Okay, we've got somebody up next, 851-787.
Hi, it's Maida Jones. I'm sorry, my computer doesn't recognize me. I have just a question, which is, I haven't heard anywhere in today's discussion anyway, anything about people with larger homes who might put an apartment in the footprint of their home, as for example, I could do with mine. I have a virtual apartment downstairs. I would just have to add a little kitchen. Otherwise, with a simple a separate entry, and I have parking, this would be very feasible. And as I live alone, would actually perhaps work quite well for me. I'm betting there are lots of homeowners like that, like me, who might add a housing unit, which obviously would be just one, for a modest amount of investment and wouldn't require much of anything except increased traffic hazards. I mean, there wouldn't be an additional footprint. Are these types of additional housing units being considered in the planning? Thank you.
Would that fall under ADU, Laura?
Yes, that would fall under accessory dwelling units or maybe junior accessory dwelling units. Or in some cases, maybe under SB 9, that recent ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Bob Kaufman.
And I'm mute here. I'd like to follow up on a theme that was raised by several of the committee members, and that is the selection of the sites and the boundaries of those particular sites. It seems to me that the selection was relatively limited, and in particular, the boundaries seem rather arbitrary. Living near a couple of those sites, you know, they're hard to understand why they're not, why adjacent properties are not included, why some adjacent properties are marked as having you know, only one side of access, where there, as the lots across the street are marked as having two, and those sorts of issues. And I would just encourage the committee to try to go back and ask staff, and particularly the consultants, to take a broader and perhaps more creative look to identifying both the boundaries of the existing sites, which are all reasonably logical, as well as possibly additional sites, particularly along the Portola Valley corridor, which, as we've heard, is kind of an issue. I think this lives up to the spirit we've heard much about of trying to decentralize the impacts of the increased density, and makes a lot of sense in many regards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rita Comas.
Hi, thank you for taking my comments. I'm very interested in the results of the survey that was just done, and it's too bad that it's not being discussed. Those results aren't being discussed as part of this conversation. And I'm very interested in the March meeting that has been talked about a few times with the community, but I haven't seen a date on the calendar yet, and maybe there is one and I've just missed it. I live on West Ridge. And one of the sites that was shown on the map that was shown was on the corner of Alpine and Westridge going east. And if there were, and if I'm, call me crazy, but there are homes there. I don't think that those lots are empty. Perhaps there are some lots there that I haven't noticed, but there are homes along that area. And if there are 20 units there, and then on Alpine Road and Westridge going west, there are then the possibility of 43 units at that location if the Stanford project moves forward with, you know, extra ADUs. That is 63 units right there at Alpine and Westridge. Right now, when I'm going down and waiting to make a left-hand turn, sometimes it takes me 5 to 7 minutes to make that turn. In an evacuation, I can only imagine what would happen with the concentration of cars in that corridor. I encourage you to look at other places. I don't think, I think there are other places in town. 63 units at that corner is just a bit much. And thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Meg.
Meg, you need to unmute on your end. There you go.
Trying. It's not always that easy. I actually didn't have a comment until you guys started suggesting that everyone should write in their comments, so we couldn't hear the comments. And I find that very disappointing. Also cutting people off who are trying to show maps, etc. This needs to be a community endeavor, and this should be taking a lot more time. We should be looking at this over time. We've got years to deal with all of this. I know the RENA has to be turned in, but cutting off people, telling people to write their comments in is deeply undemocratic in a small community and very disappointing.
I just want to clarify, I think the point was we're happy to take the comments, but if the comments are written, Laura offered to share them with the committee so we could read them and understand them in more depth. That's all.
Okay, well, that's good. Again, I'd like to see maps put up and people given full voice if they need it. So thank you.
Okay, moving on. Bob Adams.
Yes, thank you. I live near the Nathworth Triangle, and so one of the things that I have some of the same concerns that Alan had in the schools. And if there is an evacuation, that I'm hoping the evacuation plan includes getting the kids out of school, because obviously all the parents are going to go get their kids. There's no way to organize that in a logical way that I think when people start to panic, they are going to take care of their kids, number one, no matter what the rules are. And so my only question is trying to keep the density down in the Nathworth Triangle, which I understand will be a denser place, but just understanding that that's also the focus of where the schools come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Christy Corley.
Thank you. I was on a flight, so I wasn't able to listen to the whole thing. I would like to give Karen my 2 minutes to finish her talk if she's still on. She was in the middle of something and I wanted to hear what she had to say. I also am concerned with the time of the evacuation drill. I would like to see it more in the middle of the day when the kids are available rather than 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. before the kids get there. I agree with the previous comment. And I'd like to give the rest of my talk to Karen. If you can come back on.
I asked Karen and Karen said she finished her comments.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Christy. Appreciate it. MG Lee, go ahead. MJ Lee.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and also thank you guys and ladies for the job you're doing. I really appreciate it. I know how tough this is or can be. My question is whether the east side of Alpine Road had been ruled out as a scenario. I guess when I drive down Alpine, I kind of thought that would be a great area for multifamily housing. So I was just curious about that. Thank you.
Did you get that, Laura, what she was talking about, the exact area?
I think so. Let's call it the other side of Alpine than what we're analyzing. The properties are actually quite narrow there, and there's a creek that runs across the back that has a creek setback. So once you take the scenic corridor setback and the creek setback, there's
Mhm.
almost no width left to those
Okay.
parcels. So
Okay.
we don't think that any of those are really developable as housing sites.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good question. Okay, Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, if someone pulls a map up, can you be pretty clinical about specifying exactly the lots in B and C? Because, because
yeah.
the maps shown today are more, well, the lots shown in the maps today go all the way down to Hillbrook, right? And then, but it would be helpful if the town actually, since there aren't that many lots, why don't you just clinically go through and identify each one of them so we know exactly how many of them are where in those 3 locations?
Thanks, Greg. That is what I want to do next, as soon as we're done with the community questions. Okay. And I think we're done. We got one more. Valerie Baldwin.
Okay, I've got some questions about how the maps were made up and things that are missing on the maps. When we moved here, I live on Echo Lane right behind Ramey's Garage. And when we moved here in 1982, our whole property and our home was underwater with the second year of an El Nino year. So it was terribly flooded. And there's nothing on any maps that show that there was any reason for us to be flooded. We had the town, I'm not sure if he was a geologist or what he was, come out at the time, and he said, well, when they put in Alpine Road for logging, there was a creek running right through your property. And that's what flooded your house there, was the remnants of the water trying to get somewhere. So I'm wondering why that doesn't show up on the map. The other question I have is about the faults. Somebody raised the question about why there weren't the additional faults showing up on the maps. And the Portola Valley Neighborhood United group published a map that showed a fault running right across the edge of our property in through the property at the back end of the fire station, and that's not on there either. So I'm sort of questioning, who's put these maps together and if they're very accurate. Thank you.
Okay, any comment, Laura, on that?
In regards to the flooding, we do have, excuse me, overground drainage in many cases, right, in the community. So water does flow above ground in its natural state in a lot of cases. And so when there are new projects, they have to be engineered in order to take those aspects of the site into consideration. So it's different than kind of a typical suburban community that has stormwater in pipes that goes underneath the ground and collects and goes out. So we would anticipate future projects would plan for that to the degree that we know about it. And a lot of those conditions can only be found when you do the individual investigation for those sites. But we do think that it wouldn't be too limiting in terms of the housing sites that we're talking about here. If the committee was looking at a lot of other sites in town, then we need to kind of think about those maybe with a little bit different perspective. In terms of faults, there are other faults, and there are traces that may be faults or areas that have not been confirmed as faults, and that's pretty common actually in the community. And so that's why the town geologist reviews every project that requires what we call a site development permit, to make sure that those projects are designed properly. Some of the smaller faults, you might be surprised to learn that if it's a old inactive fault, you maybe only have to design your project to be 10 or 15 feet away from it. So that it's very different than the San Andreas fault that has a very big setback. So what we gave to you are the very big physical constraints. And we certainly acknowledge that there's smaller physical constraints to sites that are geologic in the community in lots of places. but we don't think it impacts the sites that we showed you with those brighter colors, or at least not so much that you shouldn't consider them. And then we would do additional study on them. So we haven't, we haven't forgotten about other smaller faults and inactive faults in the community. We just didn't think it was as important for this conversation because it's so site specific.
Thanks for clarifying. Okay, I think we're done with community comments, questions. I wanted to, Eric Doyle had to drop off, but he emailed a question. He mentioned, Adrian, that you talked about doing smaller projects that would not use state and federal housing funds. Smaller projects are more expensive on a per cost unit and just as challenging as larger projects. Many affordable housing developers want at least 25 plus units to get them engaged. The two projects I am involved with now, Eric is involved in building affordable housing professionally. The unit costs net of land are over $500,000 per unit, which makes economic feasibility challenging. Adding the cost to acquire multiple parcels further add to the difficulty making the numbers work. All the affordable housing developers that I've interacted with will try to access those funds from federal, state. So it wouldn't be great to get clarification from her with respect to her comments on that.
I don't think it was Adrian. I think it was me.
Okay, Laura.
I think I was responding to Helen's question.
Okay.
I think the things that he's saying certainly make sense to me in my experience. Small projects are very expensive. They require site designs for a small site. I agree that the larger affordable housing developers strongly prefer larger sites without a lot of constraints. So I've worked with developers over the years that say they won't consider anything less than an acre and nothing less than 40 units per acre. So they have to get 40 or 45 units on an acre in order to even consider it.
Okay.
So that's true. That's certainly the case with the larger affordable housing developers.
Yeah.
So from a practical point of view, it may be challenging. I think staff recognizes that to have these sites developed with affordable housing. I've also worked with smaller local developers that are willing to put in some of that time and effort, but it is a lot of time and effort. And so that's where things like the town's affordable housing funds, may be important to make up some of the gap in the financing as a, future approach to this. It may be appropriate to work with some of the housing developers that may have different models. I mean, Habitat for Humanity may be a good model for this community, some other places that don't have to do those larger projects and get the tax credits in order to be able to do them.
Okay.
So I agree with his comments, and I think that they are important for this committee to take into consideration. But we're trying to do both things, is like find a plan that
Right.
HCD can sign off on and have it be reasonably feasible, and how far do we take that is a
Right.
challenge for us.
And so just a follow on question, if we do the plan and we get it approved and down the road, because the numbers just don't make a lot of sense for developers to come in and build, then what's the repercussion for Portola Valley?
So we're in this scenario, you're saying we got our housing elements certified, but the
Right.
projects aren't coming.
Right.
Okay, so depending on how it goes, we may need to revisit the policies and consider zoning changes if we're getting into the housing element cycle and nothing is happening. There's also state laws that streamline certain kinds of development if you're not meeting your numbers. So most notably, if you've heard about SB 35, that's a law that streamlines projects if you're not meeting your RHNA. And so I would guess that those kinds of laws will continue to come into play to force cities to zone for things that can be economically feasible if ours turn out not to be economically feasible. So those things could lead to more ministerial process that we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
Could it lead to increase in the intensity of the development if they're using multiple state laws together? I don't know if Cara, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Laura. The other thing that I think the committee can think about is that some of these sites that are zoned at 20 units per acre, in order to get them certified by HCD, there is a presumption that they will be available to affordable folks. However, given the land values and pricing in Portola Valley, they may not, in fact, be affordable. And what we might see is a mix of affordability. So the majority of the units may be market rate, but we could still get some of the some affordable units through additional policies like inclusionary housing policy. So, you know, we require that 20% of the total development project be deed restricted to affordable households. So it's really the income mix that I think we would look at.
Okay. And we're going to get to the policies after we choose sites down the road. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. I appreciate it. Okay. So Laura, in terms of the next step here, what do you think about putting up the map for scenario B? And I'd love for the committee just to kind of dig in and ask questions. We could maybe even zone in, zoom in, I'm sorry, on number 1.
Yeah, Carla, could you bring that up for us?
And just to kick things off,
do you want to, I'm sorry, do you want to look at number 1 a little closer?
Yeah, if we could to zoom into 1.
Yeah, so let's zoom in on 1.
That would be great.
Let me tell you a couple things I was thinking about these sites as I was preparing for this meeting for the committee to think about. So I think that's pretty good. Is that good, Jocelyn?
Yeah, I think that's good for me.
So number 1, you can see a couple things. You can see the pink is the fault. And so for this area, that's a pretty restrictive thing, that fault setback in the pink. And then that blue line is Saucil Creek. And Saucil Creek is one of the creeks in the community that has a larger setback. So we have 3 creeks that have bigger setbacks to them. And so at Saucil Creek, the setbacks around the creek vary between 35 and 55 feet, depending on lot size. So that is a somewhat limiting factor of those properties where Saucil Creek goes through. In terms of what those properties include, the larger kind of weird shaped one, that's Village Square. So that's the shopping center. That has CC zoning in it. So that's commercial zoning. So residential is not allowed there at all right now. So it does have some potential to increase intensity by adding residential to that site. But I don't know that we would expect it to completely redevelop, you know, from the shopping center. There's a small triangle next to that. That's developed with a small kind of commercial space and 1 or 2 residential units already behind it. So I don't know if that would really redevelop into much. Kind of moving to the right, you've probably seen what people refer to as the Hallett store. Is that historic building that was renovated recently in the last couple of years into offices. So that's done. The site behind it is a very small vacant lot that will probably be a single family home. They've been approved for it, but it hasn't moved forward. Then there's 2 new single family homes at the back there that are just recently constructed. So unfortunately, just because of timing, that's a missed opportunity for the housing element process. And then 2 lots down from there is the fire district. So this group of lots in scenario number one, between the fault, the creek, and the existing uses is pretty constrained already. So I would recommend you focus on maybe Village Square being an opportunity for an increase in intensity by adding zoning that would allow residential at that location.
Laura, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Two questions really. One, why not include that large open blank space just to the left of the turquoise? And number two, when you rezone, but there's existing structures and existing owners there, it seems like the probability of any one person being willing to sell to a new owner or redevelop themselves within an 8-year span is pretty low. And so how do you think about that? Sure, you rezone, but it's already populated and people stay for decades in their house. How should we think about that problem?
It's going to depend on the economics, right? So demographically, we know that we have a pretty large amount of older homeowners. So we saw that when we looked at the demographics. We know that certainly older baby boomers and people older than that are selling their properties at higher numbers than in the past. So we are seeing more things turn over than we would have in the past. Village Square is owned by a real estate agent and broker. So if there's market value in adding residential units there, I think that's a possibility. Why we didn't include the space to the side of that is because that's Windmill School and they just finished construction. So we have no reason to think, and a lot, for those of you that are familiar with it, of energy went into them locating at that location. There's a lot of history. So we did not identify that as a potential site to even analyze.
Okay, thank you.
And it was just raining and I forgot what rain sounded like. I was like, it's raining and I was like, okay, wow. I don't know if you all all of you are traveling, but I'm in Portola Valley and it was just raining.
I didn't even notice. So, people just jump in with questions at this point. We've lost the hands, I think, right here, but I want everybody to feel that they can participate and ask questions and make comments who are on the committee.
Laura, would the opportunity to use a concession apply to the setback from the creek? Maybe that's a town attorney kind of question.
A concession under density bonus law? Potentially, we have been, as we've been talking about this preliminarily, pretty conservative around our creek setbacks. But the range of the creek setback could certainly be considered. And so like we have the range that's from 35 to 55, and that's a pretty old code section. So it might be worth considering whether that setback is the right setback. But I think, a waiver could be possible. Cara, what do you think?
Yes, I think a waiver could be possible, provided the setback was there for an aesthetic reason. If it is a safety reason, then there would be, a ground for the town denying that waiver request.
I'm completely on board with that. Yeah, I'd only wanted to raise the issue in that I think that there may be more flexibility than may be present at first blush. On the other hand, there may also be some really good reasons why that site also doesn't make sense. But appreciate it. Thank you.
So I have questions. And I appreciate Nicholas, the waiver situation. I appreciate that. Is that okay that I talk?
Go for it, Helen. Yeah, I
Okay.
can't see anybody right now, so.
I know because of the shares.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know that this is about that we have, we're looking at these 2 sites or 3 sites, also the one up near Ford Field. So, but I'm concerned that and maybe it's because we're talking about these sites and maybe it's for another agenda. So I just wanted to talk about how we're not, are we trying to get just these sites? Are we going to talk about other tools? Like we talked about ADUs, the SB9, it seems like is not being utilized. So potentially changing that to make it more viable to spread out some of these units. And so that's what I'm curious about.
Okay, so when we talked about this in October, do you remember we looked at some of the other sites? And so these are the 2 that got us the most units. And then we had a scenario where we reduced lot sizes, but still kept them, like pretty big, but made them a little smaller. And that did result in market rate units potentially being created. So if the committee is interested in going in that direction, we certainly could talk about that more. We didn't do any additional analysis because the constraints map with all of the different grays kind of takes care of that. So if you wanted to look at other lot split areas, we would probably want to use the constraints map as a tool to look at that. And then the other thing that we analyzed was increased density in the RE district, which is, a big portion of the community. That resulted in a few units, but that actually is pretty similar to SB9, meaning it allows an additional house on lots that already exist. So we're still working with the consultants to see if we can include a few SB9 units, but it probably won't be much. But since we modeled this one, we could maybe get a couple of units that way. So those are the 2 things we've already considered to spread units out in the community. We have not analyzed for you any ways to spread multifamily out into the community. And so if you wanted us to look at that, that's what would be a little bit of a departure at this point. So we would need to hear, consensus of the committee if you wanted us to look into that further.
So, I personally would like to see evaluation of SB9 implementation because I personally economically, I don't think it works for people as implemented right now. So I personally would like, some analysis around that, because if we could spread some of the units around town that way, I support that. I don't know if the rest of the committee does. And again, I believe that helps with the fair housing situation. I also know that there were other public parcels in town that originally were considered for housing. And do we want to bring any of those back up potentially? I know the council has already voted on some of those parcels, but I just thought I would bring it up.
That's a good point. So let us go back and take another look and make sure there were constraints on all those parcels. And I don't think we need to get too much into the details tonight. Nicholas was on that committee and Jeremy was leading that effort for town-owned property. The only one that council made an active vote of support around considering it more is the town center parcel. And we did include just a couple units under affiliated housing in the table for that one.
Okay, so that'd be great. Thank you.
This is Bill Kelly. Is it okay to talk now?
Go for
Hi.
it.
So my 2 cents on this is that I think this whole notion of spreading these units around the town is just flawed and not likely to lead to the result that we want to lead to. I think the logical development corridors in this town are along Alpine Road and Portola Road. That's logical, not just from the standpoint of things like transportation. If you build development along Alpine Road, for example, particularly if people are going to places like Stanford, it becomes very bikeable. And to me, one of our goals ought to be in this process, not building homes that require you to have 2 cars. One car would be more than enough, I think, for a lot of people living in that scenario. I think environmentally, fewer cars is a great idea. I think in terms of our traffic, that's a good idea as well. In terms of creating customers for our merchants that are in and around the town, that's also consistent with that. But as much as anything, I think we need to focus on realistic development. And it seems to me the more fragmented we do this, the less realistic it becomes. And I also would resist the characterization that this is somehow a burden and that we should be sharing this horrible thing that we're having to create. I don't view it as such a horrible thing. I've spent most of my life living in places that are full of multifamily housing. It adds people, it adds diversity, it adds energy. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. So clustering it in places where there's transportation available, where there's commercial services available, that all strikes me as a good thing. So I mean, I'm sure there are other sites one could look at, but it would seem to me that if we're going to try to solve this problem, focusing on the two logical corridors here, Alpine and Portola, and perhaps expanding along those corridors so that we're not necessarily dealing with the somewhat restrictive descriptions that we have right now, would be the way to go. That's what I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so you guys, it's just seeming like with this number one, that there's not a lot of area there to get many units. I mean, Village Square, Laura, you've pointed out, is probably the best, bet in that string of properties in number one there, but even that seems, I don't know. So I'm wondering if we could maybe just move. I'm wondering if we could just move the discussion on to number two now, kind of that Nathorst Triangle area.
Chair Swisher, I had a question and comment about Village Square, actually.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. Thank you. So if memory serves, I don't need an answer for this right now, but memory serves, it's, I think, almost 2 acres there. My question is, what would a mixed, both in terms of just the zoning changes required, what would like a mixed use zoning look like for something like Village Square, which would sort of speak to Bill's point about sort of combining some housing with some retail businesses in a way that I think would be interesting and attractive. And the other point, well, I'll take the other point. So my question would just be, what would the ramifications be of introducing mixed use zoning at anywhere along this corridor, just sort of the idea of mixing some housing with some retail or other uses.
I think it would be a good approach to diversify the uses that are allowed there. So the CC zoning where Village Square is doesn't allow residential at all. So I think introducing residential and allowing mixed use, even allowing it to be redeveloped as a mixed use development, or adding residential to the existing development are both solid policies to consider there. And then for the other properties, I would probably go ahead and open them up for more intensity of development and not assume much is going to happen, but create a way for it to happen if the market conditions change or something changes on those properties. So even though we're probably not going to get a lot of units here, I think it would be a good idea to put policies in place that allow residential at these locations, or not just single family in the AP district, but a little bit more intensity of development. Because Nicholas's point was a very good one, that there are some tools that someone who knows what they're doing could put the package of tools together and maybe build some units. Not a lot, but a few.
Okay. Can we go on to number two now and just dig into, really curious, like if we could even identify, where Roberts is, where the Willow Commons is going to be. Is it possible to do that?
We did, I know them pretty well off the top of my head. Probably together we can figure it out.
Yeah.
So there's two. So there's the kind of trapezoid one that goes out to Nathorst from Alpine. That blue line is just a small seasonal, and calling it a creek is a little bit of an overstatement. Okay, but we wanted to put it on this map so people are aware of it. It is on the general plan map for Nathorst Triangle, and it's just a small seasonal waterway, but we do have to take that into consideration. So,
And is
Willow
that where that,
Commons is
that's the
second-
office buildings there on that trapezoid?
Yeah,
Right
that's
on the road?
office. And then commercial is sort of like right at the tip of the corner, right? You can imagine that of the two streets.
Yeah.
Then Roberts, there's an empty lot behind Roberts where nothing is. It's a little, maybe a little bit wet from that seasonal, do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Waterway that
Yeah.
goes through, but not insurmountable. Then there's two kind of skinnier lots.
Mm.
One of those is Willow Commons.
Mhm.
Willow Commons was able to design their project in two pieces on both sides of that seasonal creek with a little bridge over it. So they were able to find a way to do that. The same property owners own the adjacent parcel as are building Willow Commons. We have not talked to them about their intention for that, but I think it is an appropriate housing site.
Okay.
And then, you know, around the other direction, Portola Road, there's, you know, the other office building, the other direction, and then, you know, across the street is the gas station, and then that small little strip center with the deli and the little office next to it. So I think everyone has a pretty good picture of this. I wonder, since we're considering scenarios B and C, if we should switch to the map that shows this in a little bit different scenario. I think
Can I
the
just
other one's
ask-
a little bit different.
Sure, that's fine. The clarifying though, the Willow Commons, is that next to the trapezoid?
Yes.
It's next to the trapezoid. And then I drove down that Nathorst Road today, and behind the offices in the trapezoid, there's like a couple empty like tennis courts that aren't being used, and there's parking for the offices, which, but that is included in the trapezoid.
Yeah, so this was, so that the one we just had only included parcels that were zoned for commercial.
Okay, so
Okay,
everything
so-
green there is all commercial, right?
Or AP. So you know what I mean? So this scenario was to increase the intensity of those uses. The
mhm.
other scenario was the one that added parcels and created the a new zoning district. So that's probably the one that we want to look at. 'Cause
Okay.
The committee seems to be going in the direction of doing scenario B and C.
Mhm.
But feels like where we're, at least where this discussion is going, not where your decision is going.
Yeah.
So, so this map adds a couple of more parcels in each direction with the idea of, the planning principle would be more of like a, center of town feeling. I don't say town center because where I'm sitting is town center, right? But a little bit of a cluster of housing units and services and stores together. It's a common principle, right? So that's why we included the study area to go a little bit farther in each direction. I think it goes up to Hillbrook on one side, and then it goes the other side on Portola up to the parcels that belong to the Priory.
And so Laura, are they single family homes on the areas that are in the extended, well, number one above, those are single family homes currently, right?
Yeah, there's single family homes, there's a parking lot, right? But yeah, primarily single family homes.
And then around the Nathorst area, the additional purple areas that you've added in, are those all single family homes today?
I'm not 100% sure. Adrian, do you have that table by any chance? And just kind of give us the highlights.
I'll have to pull that up. I'm sorry. I'll just circle back to me. I'll get it
Okay.
ready.
Okay.
Okay. So I wonder, it's hard to have a committee discussion with the map up. I'm struggling how to do this. I wonder if we can.
Okay, it depends on what screen you're on, but what I do, if it's helpful, is make sure you're in a side-by-side gallery view.
Okay.
So upper right-hand corner, side-by-side
Well, that
gallery.
helps. Yeah, now I can see
Okay,
some.
then
people.
there's a little arrow so you can move the screen back and
Yeah,
forth. So
thank
I
you.
can see all of you and the map right now.
Before the map goes away, could someone put a cursor over Triangle Park?
Carla's sharing. Do you know where Triangle Park is? It's the corner of Alpine and Portola. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the park's at the front and then the commercial development is behind it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Laura, can you please take us through how large this site is? And when you look at this location, what do you see? And I think you called out a little bit of a town. So you put on your developer hat and you said, yeah, this is going to be a town center kind of increase density kind of product. But can you take us through what this is and how you see it? It's got some clear assembly problems with it that it would also be helpful if you could take us through some of the limitations to the site as well. But one of the things that, and I think that I had a hard time with on the last site, is if we can try and do this in a structured way. So what makes it a good site? How do we think about it? And what are some of the limitations? And that may help us in further conversations as we look at additional properties.
Okay, so starting with the commercial tenants primarily have leases, many long-standing businesses. We don't expect them to really make dramatic changes. I'd be a little bit surprised, but there might be areas where some units could be added, or we might see bigger changes that happen, over a longer time period. So those are, somewhat constrained. We've talked about single family homes are going to depend on the interest of that property owner and the market, whether single family homes are going to develop into something more intensive than that. But that's the reality of what we have available, is we have either commercial properties with good leases, or we have single family homes, because that's who we are, is what we have as single family homes. So when I look at this area, I see the potential over time for property owners potentially to sell their properties. A couple of those could be combined so that slightly larger projects would be possible. So site planning would be easier. Building on a little bit larger site is going to be less risky, less expensive. We do have the list that Adrian's pulling up that includes the areas of these properties. And some of them might be bigger than you realize in terms of the range of how big they are. So I don't know if you've got that handy, Adrian.
I do have it. Do you want me to share it, or do you want me to just sort of rhyme off what I'm looking at here?
It's an Excel spreadsheet, might be kind of hard to share, but kind of give us the sense of what's the range of these lot sizes at the Portola Alpine corner.
Right. So at the corner, they're around, the largest is 1.14 acres. The smallest is 0.8, where those commercially developed parcels are. The single family developed parcels that flank either side of those clustered of commercial properties, they're a bit larger. So for example, the Nathhurst Avenue, the Nathhurst Avenue that runs sort of behind the commercial properties, those range from 1.01 acres to 1.64. So they're a bit larger. And then if you kind of curve around onto Alpine Road and you go past Roberts and you sort of make your way down to those Nathhurst properties, those are primarily almost all 1 acre each.
Could I ask why we seem to have drawn a bright line on one side of Portola Road? Because we have commercial businesses on the other side of the road. Why wouldn't they be included in this zone?
They are. This is the way that we've mapped it. So this is two different scenarios that we were trying to show you. So I'm realizing we originally mapped them together and it was confusing. So would you, Carla, would you toggle back to the other one? right? So the other one,
Oh,
those are little
okay.
commercial properties across the
Yeah.
street.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Yep.
Next time we'll do that side by side or overlap
Yeah.
for you. So to kind of back to Nicholas's question, when I see this, there's significant constraints here. I mean, we're just being honest about it, right? Someone would have to design something that would deal with that seasonal creek area. You would probably want to consolidate a couple lots together if you were a developer. But we did see the Willow Commons project come through with 13 units on one of the constrained sites. They're very motivated to do a special kind of supportive housing project. Their project is very expensive on a per unit basis. Those things are true. But we did see that it's possible. And that site, they've got 13 units on it. If we had density that allowed a higher amount, you could fit more than 13 units and it would still, I think, be very consistent potentially with the community standards if it was well designed. You know, more setback on the scenic corridor, maybe a little bit more height setback, a little bit more from the road, but not too intrusive.
So am I right that this is like 4 or 5 acres net?
Oh, altogether,
gross, rather.
altogether, it's more than that. Adrian, what do you think it is altogether? All the purple and at the corner, not up on Alpine by Ladera, but at the corner.
Okay.
Quick
One
math.
quick second, I'm gonna do it. I'm just gonna do.
Yeah, do a quick sum and we'll come back to you.
Yeah, okay.
Laura, I'm curious on the purple single-family homes on Portola Road approaching Priory. I mean, we could add homes behind that too, right?
Yes,
Like extend the purple on that whole area.
yes, absolutely, you could.
Mhm.
Again, this was just a starting point. It wasn't, this
Right.
isn't even a recommendation from staff. This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
just
yeah.
a starting point.
Yeah.
So
And
I'm
I
seeing,
also,
sorry, I was just gonna say quickly, I'm seeing 18 acres altogether.
wow. So, I mean, can I also just comment on Bill Kelly? I totally respect what you said and I love the biking idea, but as we're looking at how to reach our RENA goals of 300 units, like looking at these constrained sites, like 18 acres is enormous and we could absolutely put 300 units there, but I doubt the town wants us to put 300 units there. And that's why I would suggest looking at other tools and other sites to spread them out. So that's why I was bringing up those, we have other tools to make, if we were to get 4 units somewhere else, for instance, that's only 296 units elsewhere that we would need to put. That was my comment. So respectfully, Bill, I totally appreciate what you said. I agree that our main arterial routes are fabulous to bike on, and I would love to see that in a shuttle around town to cut down on emissions. That said, I just would like to, I just needed to say that. I do have to go feed my kid again, so I'm sorry.
Helen, before you go, I just want to make sure we're clear. We're talking about 150 units because we
Oh,
already
right.
have a plan to get to the other ones. So
Right.
right now the site's for 150.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you. So right, 150 units, we could put them all, there, but we have multiple tools that we could, when I say spread it out, we have multiple tools that we can consider to make it more feasible for people to build throughout the town. These smaller, 1 or 2 more units on a private property or something like that kind of idea. Although right now economically for developers with a 1,200 square foot limit, it's not economically feasible. So, okay, thanks you guys. And
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks,
Yep.
Helen.
Thanks.
So Laura,
If I could, through the chair,
Yeah.
number 1, Zeke has his hand up, but number 2,
Yeah.
I wonder if the committee could ask any additional questions from Zeke so that he could go on with his evening.
yeah. And then I think we can wrap up pretty soon. Okay, so Zeke,
Yeah, what Laura said.
do you have your hand up or you want to just have any
I
questions?
wanted to, I
Yeah.
do need to run, so if there are
Yeah.
other questions for me, I'm available.
Okay, I guess Amy or Sarah, do you have questions for Zeke? No, okay. Anybody have questions for Zeke?
Thanks, everyone. Good
Thank
working
you
with
for
you.
Thank you,
participating.
Zeke.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
All right. So why don't we go to Amy and then Sarah, please?
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm getting a little signal that says my signal is not good. So if I die out, you'll know. A couple of questions. When we talk, something Laura said really kind of stuck with me, talking about the cost per unit for Willow Commons. You know, is that a metric we should be thinking about when we think about feasibility? And by that, I mean, Willow Commons is being built not because it's a good commercial idea. It's not being built as a profit-making undertaking, as I understand it. It's being built at great cost per unit. And it's wonderful that it's being built, but I'm wondering about, in terms of looking at how we zone or any zoning changes that might be made to these parcels, and any density change, you know, density allowances that change. It seems to me we ought to be thinking about trying to get the cost per unit into some reasonable range, or, you know, aren't we going to run into a problem when it comes time to try to establish feasibility? You know, is it feasible that another developer is going to come in at a $500K per unit cost? I guess I'm just wondering how much of a factor that's going to be as we think about changes to, you know, to zoning and to density.
So it's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, in that we think the modeling that we've done is going to be sufficient for HCD, for certification of the housing element. Is it going to be good enough for the market to really rise and build the units? We're not sure. You know, I think the number that they used was $650 a unit in that model. And they used a lot of our development standards that I gave them, and I gave them standards that resulted in about 12 units per acre. I didn't give them a really high number to study because I wanted to study something that I thought might be palatable to the community. And so what I asked them to study was something actually kind of similar to Willow Commons. And Willow Commons is telling us this is very expensive, no one would ever do it. But the model says somebody might do it, right? So this is kind of the model is a little bit blunt.
Well, and do we have, I mean, are there assurances that an HCD is going to give us kind of a safe harbor? I mean,
we're pretty sure. We're pretty sure that they're going to give us a safe harbor with that model.
Okay.
So 21 Elements has reviewed the model with HCD staff. They won't put anything in writing. Yeah, but they have given a verbal, yeah, we think this model is sufficient.
Okay, it just makes me a little nervous, but
yeah, us too. Us too.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Laura?
That was really helpful.
I have a question about that approach, and basically it's a design criteria or a performance as a design criteria based credit, which is cool, assuming they actually come through. If we were to do a floating zone that could land, for example, on any one of these three areas, you know, and we could figure out whatever the parameters are, whether it's a mixed use or it's a straight up multifamily meeting 20 dwelling units per acre. Do we get credit for that? Could we get credit for that? Basically,
I mean, I think we have to
selected
pin it down.
these
Are you saying, do we have to pin it down to specific sites?
Exactly. So the criteria that you picked for these three sites was they were, you know, and this is going to rub some of us the wrong way, but basically safety unconstrained. You had three safety factors, and you said, where do I not have three safety factors that are in roughly urbanized areas? And you could come up with different kinds of criteria that this group could come up with. Establish that you can have 20 dwelling units per acre on any such area. You'd make it discretionary and take it in. Does that work with our friends over at HCD? And
Okay, I
again, this
don't
may be
think so, but I definitely, Curtis has his hand up, good. I think we have to identify enough specific sites to meet the vast majority of our requirements. Then
Okay.
if we created zoning that took all of our constraints into effect and did a, not, your word is floating, but I would say an actual permanent like overlay zone or something permanent to allow some increase in density throughout the whole community, that would work. But we couldn't count that for much of anything because we wouldn't have studied all of those individual sites to show that they're feasible. So that's my initial reaction. I want to see what Curtis has to think too.
So no, Laura, you hit it correctly. You have to identify specific sites. You can't just say, well, if you go find a site and it meets these criteria, that we could get approval. They want to be able to identify the specific sites, and the town is going to have to provide some justification on those sites as far as the viability, not only financial, but that it the possibility of it developing, probability of it developing over the next 8 years, which is the cycle for the housing element.
That sounds fine. Says basically we take the most excellent Director Russell criteria and we plug it into your model. And then we can analyze them and we can select them on council gets to make a decision on a case-by-case basis, on a proposal-by-proposal basis.
Well, it wouldn't be on a case by case. You would have to identify specific sites that would cover your RHNA allocation in each of the income levels.
No, I follow. That's interesting. Thank you.
So Amy, are you done with questions?
Oh, hold on. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, thank you. Sarah, go ahead, and then Jeff.
Yeah, so I kind of am feeling like I'm interested in looking at all of them, not like B versus C.
Right.
I think I'm hearing that from a couple people. And I guess a question I have is if we were to do that and look across everything that's in color and focused initially on everything that's already commercial in some way, shape, or form, how many additional lots that are single family currently would we need to be looking at if we prioritized everything that's already, across all scenarios?
If we prioritize the commercial sites?
Yeah. Like, I don't know how many lots in total across, you take scenario B and scenario C, you combine them. Let's say there's, I don't know how many lots you have here across all of them, maybe 70. I'm bad at estimating. How much could we accomplish towards our 150 if we prioritized initially ones that are already commercial? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that if we prioritize only one type of parcel, meaning only commercial, I think that will not be well received by HCD because they know that historically with different housing elements, the sites that are already developed as commercial don't redevelop very often. And so that's why they've added extra rules that we have to look at these sites to analyze whether we think they'll redevelop. So this is still, and it's crazy because we're still figuring this out, but we imagine having to really look at these sites individually and figure out, what's possible. And in some places, they're contacting owners and asking how long leases are and finding out how interested they are. I mean, it's a really detailed process. And so if we're going to focus on commercial sites, I think the burden would be, we would have to do all of that analysis to prove to HCD that they would either redevelop completely or that there's room to add residential units to the sites.
That's so interesting. I mean, this is just a comment. I guess my point of view is, in a community like ours, I think it's also unlikely that a single family house is, people live here for 50 years. I don't know that you're going to get that kind of turnover on a single family lot either. So.
Right. But HCD doesn't know. I mean, a couple of their staff members came here for a couple hours and we explained a lot of things to them. But that's why, in my mind, suggesting different types of sites to put forward to say there's challenges for both of these types, commercial and single family, to redevelop, but we're presenting both. Like, there's some value to me in that, in terms of HCD thinking that that's a good approach.
So I'm wondering, for the next meeting, do you think it'd be possible for every parcel that's on B and C to kind of estimate, given the acreage for each lot, the amount of housing that would make sense to go there, where we can actually drill down the next level and see what we're looking at?
We could do some ranges, but it would be ranges at this stage. Yeah, we could do some ranges.
And then separate commercial from single family, maybe.
Yeah, we could do like, what's the existing use, what's the size, and like, what's a range that, you might see. But this is tough because usually people are going to consolidate lots. A lot of times they're going to buy two next door lots. That makes it even harder.
Yeah.
But it's hard to guess. But
Yeah,
we can try.
the timing coming up that two lots would be on the market at the same time is.
Well, one comes up and then the developer goes to the next door neighbor and offers them a bunch of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to finish my comment, I guess for next time, I would be curious to see, I guess I'm curious what the committee feels, because I don't think it should be the majority. I guess a question of is, do we want to think about what the majority of the committee wants in terms of, is there interest at looking at spreading out? And I guess that dovetails, Laura, with, I know you just closed up the survey, findings from that survey. My understanding is that's going to be shared at the next meeting. So that was my last comment.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, Jeff, and then Al.
Thanks. I apologize. My internet is very spotty. I'm in Kirkwood, and I'll do this again. I wanted to just follow up on Helen's comments about, and again, about sort of spreading things out. And so we're talking, and all of Portola Valley right now is single family, so everything is one house per property. And we're talking about these, these corridor developments, which would be part of the solution, which would be 28 units per property, per parcel. But like Helen's bringing up something, the question I had, which is that, is there an intermediate tool of, say like 4 to 5 or 4 to 6 units per property, with the understanding, my understanding now is that it would almost certainly be market rate housing, as opposed, none of it would likely be affordable. And there's also just the economic reality that on a lot of lots in town, even 4 or 5 properties or 4 or 5 homes wouldn't pencil out versus one large house. I'm just curious. It feels like there's kind of a gap there going from 1 unit to 20 units. And I'm wondering if other people wanted to explore that as a tool for maybe possibly spreading out a few things safely, of course, but just as a sort of an intermediate density, so to speak. That is my comment and question.
Would you like me to illustrate how that might work as an example? Would that be helpful as to this conversation?
Sure, please. Yes.
Okay, so one of the things I've thought about, Carla, would you go to one of the constraints maps with the gray? One of the things that I've thought about is to potentially rezone some properties that don't have darker grays, right? That don't have constraints, And this simplifies a little bit, but we probably want some of the fire safety and geologic constraints to be the most important, right? But this captures it pretty well. And we might allow in a case like that, something like 6 units per acre. And I'm choosing the 6 on purpose because what I'm thinking is a common inclusionary housing requirement is 15%. So if you allowed 6 units per acre, 1 would be affordable and 5 would be market rate. And then you would be spreading some of the affordable units around the community. So that would be a way that would be an intermediate step. And again, trying to visualize it, 6 units on an acre is different than what Portola Valley is used to, but imagine the Priory building is 6 units. So maybe that would be 6 townhouses instead of 1 big single family home and an ADU on a property. So it would visually be different, but it would be a way to spread market rate units around the community and just a few affordable units around the community. So that would be something that the committee could look at if we wanted to start with the constraints map and then figure out if there are sites to do that. Now, we're not going to be able to count very much of that, in my opinion, because we're not going to be able to drill down to that same level of detail. You know what I mean? We're probably not going to count all those individual sites. So we would want to, work with our consultant partners to think how we would capture that. But it would achieve that philosophical goal of spreading things more throughout the community. Now, this is so technical, and I'm sorry, this is always so hard, but the other part of this are limitations by the homeowners associations. And so from a realistic point of view, maybe a couple of the parcels that we see that have the least constraints that could take some more units are in Westridge. And the Westridge HOA, do you know what I mean, may or may not allow those projects to go forward, even if the town rezoned for them. So that's another complication.
Okay, Jeff, do you have more?
No, that was my one point. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's a good idea. If I want to maybe when we're done in a couple of minutes, lose the map and then just kind of take some show of hands. But if the committee is behind looking at intermediate density possibilities too, then that we could kind of look at that as well. All right, Al, you got your hand up.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I think that the both scenario B and C that Laura has shown us are very good. I guess I'd just like to throw one other parcel into the mix. I think that we ought to take a look at the Glen Oaks area. I know that we've said that, there's a creek behind it and we've got the scenic corridor setback, but both of those I think are things that could be potentially relaxed a little bit. And if we could relax them a little bit, could we get a parcel that would then be developable there? So, it's just another possibility of something that might help a little bit.
Yeah, Al, is that where the horse?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Stables are and riding areas, yeah.
Yes.
And is that Stanford land, as I understand?
It is Stanford land, I
Yeah.
think.
I keep driving by there and thinking the same thing, like it makes sense to me as a potential site down the road.
And I'd like to apologize for dropping off briefly. I'm having some internet problems also.
No worries at all. Okay.
And there are remarkably few horses there, I would say. Someone who comes, so really, I don't think any horses would be inconvenienced. Yeah.
So the business model could make sense there. Okay, well, I think that's a good idea. So Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think we need to be looking at keeping all options open. I do think the sites that have been identified are obviously the likeliest ones. I do think some areas adjacent to those areas would also work. And I would be in favor of keeping as much in play as possible. At the end of the day, it's the developers and the people who are willing to spend the money that are going to make the decisions. All we can do is facilitate. And I think we need to keep as many options open as possible.
Thank you. Okay. So how about, I'm wondering, Laura, could we maybe put the map away so we can have everybody together? Thank you. All right, I guess I wanted to just sort of get a show of hands if people are supportive of continuing to support B and C as a possible solution. Okay. So that's good. Show of hands if people want to kind of look into the intermediate density ideas that's come up, where we're sort of spreading out and we have maybe 6 units per acre. Okay, so it seems like most people are supportive of that as well. Show of hands if you want to look into the Glen Oaks property as a possible solution.
I'm not familiar with that property. Could you describe where it is?
Yeah, it's, well, Al, you can jump in too. It's as you're coming up Alpine towards the school, say, it's on the left and it's kind of down below the road a bit.
Got it.
And
Yep.
it's the horse, it's kind of horse stables and riding rings
Okay, thank you.
as you approach Arastradero. Yeah. Okay, so it seems like most people are open to kind of looking at that as for feasibility. Does anybody have any other things that you want to run by the committee for next steps?
I've got some comments. So
Yeah,
time to
Bob.
share them. First of all, I meant to thank Laura and Adrian and the rest of the staff and the consultants for compiling this material, which is incredibly complex, and you presented it in a way that was very easily digestible. So applause to you for that. I mean, it represents a lot of work, and it would have been a lot more ugly if I had been the one doing it. So thank you. The engineer in me is very uncomfortable with where we are in terms of understanding our hazard and risk. With respect to Zeke Ludner, his depth of knowledge is impressive. There's no doubt about that. But the state mandates for very high fire hazard severity zones require hazard and risk assessments. CAL FIRE regulations, NFPA also hazard and risk. And it's a little bit anxiety provoking for me to hear Zeke simply say, well, don't worry about the risk. If you do adequate mitigation, it's not an issue. It's very uncomfortable for me to not have that assessed. And my intuition is that stretch on Alpine by Ladera, that's at the base of a hill. There's a lot of reasons why that's attractive, but the risk hasn't been evaluated. And so my question, I guess, to the staff is, do we need to vote on this in a week? Or is this something that we could wait until the district weighs in? A similar concern I have is the evacuation. Ladera is right there. From evacuation potential, are we better off being on Portola Road? Zeke Ludner was saying it doesn't matter. That's not very satisfying either. So that's what I'm having some anxiety about. And I wonder about the schedule and whether we can collect more data before we actually vote on this. It's a question to Laura, I guess.
The simple answer is no, we cannot wait. If we don't move forward, we will be in danger of not completing the work and not being in compliance and not getting certified in time. So I'll also ask Curtis, would you tag in on this one as well?
Yeah, I think one of the important considerations is getting your zoning in place before the end of next January. Because if you don't, then you have less time to do the rezoning, but when you do it, it has to be by right. If somebody provides 20% below market rate housing, there could not be any discretionary approval. And why that may seem like a long time to do the environmental analysis, we really need to get started very quickly in order to prepare those documents and go through the public review process that an environmental document has in order for the town to be able to approve those sites in that period of time. So it becomes a balancing act if you want to maintain your discretionary authority over the review of future housing projects, and also getting the housing element certified by the state in the timeframes that they have.
So the decision would need to be made by March in order to get that done by the end of the year. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, because we want the recommendations of this committee to then go to a community-wide meeting and to a council meeting, a joint session of Planning Commission and Council, so that we really have that robust different audiences participating. And then those recommendations would be brought into a full draft of the housing element. And I know it seems ridiculously early, but HCD has pushed up the time that we have to submit to them. Basically, they're giving themselves more time to review it, but they're not giving us more time to complete it. And that we have heard from the other regions that are on a different cycle than us, then a lot of the housing elements are not getting approved the first time they review them. So we're trying to anticipate that because there's some negative consequences for the town, as Curtis was alluding to. And my assumption as the planning director has been that it's a primary objective of the town to keep its discretionary review authority over projects. That's an important part of how this town conducts planning and zoning business. That we want ASCC to review projects. We want Conservation Committee to review projects. We want Trails Committee to review projects. So we have to stay on this timeline to preserve that ability to keep that intact.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. One other comment I have is to reiterate Judith Murphy's request that if it's possible to get some images that would, make what we're talking about a little more concrete and less abstract. I'd find that helpful too. Thank you.
I agree. I think that would be very helpful. All right, thanks, Bob. Andrew, did you have a question?
Oh, no, I forgot to take my hand down. Sorry.
Okay. Sarah, your hand is up. Is that a real hand?
That's a real hand. I was just going to
Okay.
make a comment just to remind the group that as we heard at the start of this meeting, which feels like it was yesterday, there is the process that Woodside Fire is going through, and that process is going to dovetail with this. We have, as Laura just said, I feel like in this new role as a council member, there are so many state regulations and mandates put upon us, and our hands are tied by these timelines. And so ideally, we'd have, the full fire mapping process done ahead. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So I really appreciate the diligence that Laura and staff are going through to keep us on track with our commitment to the state regulations. And then when we get, updated information from the district, we'll bring that in, and if we have to make adjustments, then that's when we'll do it. But I think we have to stay the course in order to meet our commitments to, our state.
So Sarah, you're saying it's not necessarily going to be cast in stone after we vote next week. It's potentially changeable if there's significant findings down the road.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Laura mentioned that at the beginning of the meeting when she was talking about, I don't know if you want to reiterate that part, Laura.
Yeah, depending on when the information comes in and what stage we're at, and depending on the nature of the information, we may just have to regroup and figure out what to do. So in a worst case scenario, if a lot of information comes in that suggests that all this work we've done has a problem, then we'll have to figure out how to pivot. But it may be a full council level decision because it may be an important policy decision about the trade-offs. It depends on what time that information comes in and where we are in the process of everything else, right? It might slide in at the perfect time and we're doing we're working on our environmental document and we get more information and we weave it in and it's no problem. If it's my good luck, it'll come in at the worst possible time and we'll have to revisit all of this and do another revision. But those will be the decisions that will rest, with either the council subcommittee or even the full council, depending on the scope of it.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to chime in that we not only are waiting for the fire district's mapping process, but we also have to keep in mind that the state CAL FIRE is doing their own mapping process that will likely also have some impact on our assessment.
Okay, well, thank you. So Laura, do you have enough direction now from our
So
committee?
I think we have very good direction. The only thing
Okay.
I want to go back to is there was some interest in adding potentially some additional properties around the B and C scenarios.
Mhm.
So I wanted to see how much support there is for that. To kind of make the B or C scenarios a little bigger, or does anyone want to flesh that out for the group?
Well, so how about scenario C around the Nathorst Alpine Portola intersection, going further like towards that Priory area? People supportive of that?
I
thought I
guess
already went to the Priory.
what I would love to hear, and I'm not sure I've heard, is why were those lines drawn exactly where they were? I'm sure there was a thought process, but I'm not sure I heard it today. And if I can understand it, that's great, but I don't understand it right now. So I'm hoping we could perhaps revisit that.
It was me. What I was thinking was logical stop like a street. So like up to Hillbrook within Nathorst Triangle, the two sides of it. And then when I was going up towards Priory, I just grabbed there's two lots between commercial lots and the actual Priory owned lot that fronted onto Portola Road. So it was just a starting point. That was the extent of my methodology.
Okay, but I'd almost like to have the discussion on the other side of it. Here's why these other sites wouldn't make sense. Because I think in principle, if you're going along Alpine Road, for example, there's a big gap between where the Stanford type properties and all exist, and then what goes on at Nathorst. And why isn't that a single zone?
Okay,
was kind of my
I'm
question.
following now. Okay, so when I was originally looking at this, I didn't include the whole stretch of Alpine because I was thinking about the community's interest in maintaining the scenic corridor, which I had
okay.
heard a lot. And I was thinking about proximity to services and commercial businesses. So up by Ladera has access to Ladera services. And then down at Portola and Alpine has access to those services. And then in between, the community may wish to preserve its scenic corridor. But that
Got it.
was just, again, just a starting point, not even a recommendation, but just a starting point.
Okay, understood. Thanks.
So Laura, it sounds like there's interest in exploring adding some adjacent properties to these that we're looking at. So can we do that next time?
Yes, we can do some of that. So I'm trying to be realistic about what we can get back to you in a week.
Yeah.
So I think what I would ask committee members to do is also drive around if you haven't already. I know several of you have. And I know some of you were out of town. So Google is amazing. So you could also do Google site visits if you can't drive. And so if everyone could come with sort of fresh on their mind, thinking about some of those sites, staff and consultants will do our best to bring a few more sites into the mix that make sense based on this conversation that we're having. And so then we'll try to bring a few more pieces together for you for next week.
Okay, and then we'll have survey data to share next week too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Would
All
it
right.
be, would it be helpful for each of us to, you know, as we drive around or Google around, send you all at the town just kind of a list of places we would like to explore? Would that help? Like the tennis court that's abandoned. I walked by there the other day and I was like, why not here? Right? Maybe would that be helpful, even if we just shoot you an email with some?
So that is included in the purple, the tennis
Right.
court, because it's part of that commercial property, it looks like on the map, right
But I mean, in
behind there.
general, would that help? Like if we just kind of.
Okay, I'll say this, we certainly would take it, but I can't promise how much analysis we could do on it. Okay, and be very careful that you only send that kind of stuff to staff, not to the group, so that we're not violating the Brown Act.
And I think you are encouraging people, Laura, to really look at the highlighted areas, right, that we're already discussing and just get really familiar with them and adjacent properties to those.
Yes, and
Yeah.
if you're going to look at any others, be looking at those constraints maps.
Mhm.
So that, you know, we've really heard from everyone that safety's got to be number one. And those
Yeah.
maps really represent our best approximation at safety.
Okay. Nicholas?
Laura, to that end, the constraint maps that we have, you saw the ones that had, we have the constraints maps that show areas that generally within town that are unconstrained.
Yes, there would be the ones that don't have gray shading.
All right, I think we've had a lot of good discussion. Laura's got direction for the next meeting. Thank you all for your participation. So Laura, do you want to go now to the community? We have 20 people on.
We've already had community feedback.
Okay, so we're done with that.
Yeah, so we're done with that.
All right, what else do we have here?
But now the way we structured this was on purpose so that the community has heard your discussion today.
Yeah.
Members of the community that are listening, if you want to submit any written comments that you want to be in the packet for next time, like if you want your friends and neighbors to get your comments, okay, then you can email them to housing@portolavalley.net. And we need those by Thursday at noon. Okay, if you want to send in written comments, we'll send them to the committee now that you've heard all of this. And then next time we meet, members of the public will have another chance to comment. So you can submit written comments, you can come to the next meeting. All of those are choices, but we're done with the public comment for this item for tonight.
Okay, terrific. Staff update?
Okay, so the only things I wanted to make sure everyone knew, we've basically touched on, but I think we've been in this meeting for days, so it's important to just briefly. The survey is done and it's closed now. We closed it yesterday. We have just over 700 responses.
Wow.
So very good response rate. We'll have the results at the February 28th meeting for everyone. The February 28th meeting is on Monday at 4:30 again, and continuation of all this discussion. Then in March 21st is your regularly scheduled meeting. We'll be talking about programs in particular, and then we'll be bringing all those pieces together towards a full draft of the housing element. Community-wide meeting scheduled for, now this date is not final, and anytime I say something out loud, it gets really scary, okay? So we're gonna announce the final date in the next 2 days, but March 16th, okay, is the tentative date for the community meeting to be finalized within 2 days. And then there'll be a joint council and planning commission meeting, assuming we can get all the planning commissioners together for that. So that will be finalized as well. Any members of the public are new to this conversation and not already on our e-notify list, go to the town website and you can sign up to get an automatic notification and you choose housing under the news items and the calendar, every place that says housing, check that. There's like 2 places. Then you'll automatically get an email for all these meetings. There's over 400 people are getting notified of all of these meetings. So that's the best way to stay up to date. So you can get the confirmation when those things come out. So that's all I have for the staff update, except thank you. This is really excellent work that this committee has done tonight. I'm really impressed with the way that all of you have thought about this and what you bring from your perspective as residents. And this is what we hope for when we put something like this together, for you to have these kinds of discussions. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And I want to second Bob's comment. I just think, you and your team are just so impressive. You've done a really great job breaking this down for us and guiding us through it. So thank you. Okay, so the last thing, and we can go eat dinner, is the approval of minutes. Did anybody have any edits?
I think Helen sent me an email, so hold on a second, please.
I have that here.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Page 4 of the notes, 34 of the packet. She wants to add David Latina mentioned problems with setbacks. This is not in the comments. So is that regarding the Sequoia?
Yeah, that would be, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that too. That's a good one. Can add that in. And then page 4 of the notes, 34 of the packet, Walter said industrial zoning isn't what she said. She said commercial zoning. So if we could edit that.
Yep, we can fix that.
And then right at the beginning of the minutes, it says Chair Murphy, and it's actually Chair Swisher.
Definitely. Held over from the committee of
Unless
committee.
Murphy wants to take over as chair, and then we can talk about that. But that's great. Okay, so we need to have a motion to approve the minutes with these edits.
I so move.
And second,
Through the chair, you should take any public comments on the minutes.
okay. And are there any public comments on the minutes?
Bob Adams has his hand up. I don't know if that was from earlier, but I think we should give him a chance to speak in case it's on the minutes.
Okay, I think it's been up for a while. Bob, do you have any comments on the minutes? Bob?
Maybe he gave up and went to have dinner.
I don't know. Okay.
So
I
we'll
think-
assume he does not have comments on
I
the.
just need a second on the motion, please. Somebody-
Seconded. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Are we done, Laura?
Actually, I see Bob is unmuted now.
Bob?
Late.
Yeah, I had the wrong headphones on, so I couldn't talk, sorry.
I'm just,
I have no comments on the minutes. I am interested in the survey outcome, and I'm hoping it comes out before the 28th. That's all.
thank you so much for participating and for your comments. All right, guys, great job tonight. That was a lot to get through. Appreciate
Under
your-
4 hours.
We-
That's a.
We need to,
We need to vote on the minutes.
I think we need to vote on the minutes, yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
we had
I-
a motion and then it was seconded.
Okay, I had Andrew.
Now we need to
Rhodes'
vote. Oh, yeah. I always forget to
Motion,
vote.
Bob Kelly is the second.
Yeah.
Okay, so I
Bill
think
Kelly.
just all
Close
in
enough.
favor, you can say all in favor and we can see it on the Zoom.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any nays? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Meeting is
Good night.
adjourned. Have a good night, you guys. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
8:24.